Today we break down the worst hiking influencer deaths ever recorded, from a live stream event in Death Valley that became a redemption gone wrong, to a pair of influencers ignoring a ranger's direct warning as they pushed into the Furnace Creek Basin under the midday sun.
It was September 7th, 2018 in Death Valley National Park. A remote stretch of dunes, dry washes, and unmaintained tracks formed an exposed corridor where survival margins narrowed under late summer heat. Pale sand and clay reflected intense heat with little shade or landmarks beyond the road. Kishan Oren was 31, based out of San Diego. He was big into endurance running, the kind of guy who turns long desert runs into content for his audience online. He had experience with distance and training, but Death Valley, especially sustained heat like this, was something he hadn't really tested himself in before. His logistics partner, Brent Messias, 34, helped set things up. Route planning, support setup, and a mid-route water cache to make the attempt possible. A few weeks before the run, Kishan picks a 38-mile Death Valley route after reviewing satellite images and online footage. It looks doable to him, like a solid one-push endurance challenge. If it were me, I'd be careful how much I trust something like this off satellite images alone. I also start thinking about how much detail doesn't carry over when everything is flattened into a screen view. He even turns it into a live stream event, with planned water drops along the way. And there's also this underlying pressure trying to prove himself again after earlier criticism that didn't sit right with him. The planning underestimated how quickly Death Valley conditions intensify under direct sun, and how misleading satellite imagery can be in showing elevation and drainage. I keep thinking about how clean everything looks on a screen compared to how unstable it actually is. On the morning of the attempt, he began the run on livestream with steady early progress, but as temperatures rose, reflected heat from the pale terrain rapidly increased physical strain. By late morning, Oren's water consumption increased faster than planned, and his pace began to decline. Viewers noted visible strain through the livestream, including longer pauses and reduced clarity in speech. Despite this, he continued forward, emphasizing that stopping would compromise the attempt and the commitment made to his audience. A critical failure occurred at the first scheduled supply point along a desert road crossing. The water cache, intended as a primary hydration resupply, had been placed at an incorrect junction due to a mapping error during setup. When Kishan arrived, the supplies were absent. After an extended search of the area, he was forced to continue with significantly reduced hydration. At this stage, dehydration began accelerating, and early heat illness symptoms emerged, including confusion, impaired judgment, and reduced coordination. Instead of retreating along the road, Kishan committed to continuing the route toward a secondary water source marked on his map, unaware it was unreliable and seasonally dry. By early afternoon, his movement had slowed to a strained walk. Speech became fragmented, and he began showing clear signs of progressing heat stroke. He consumed his remaining water and reached the mapped water source, which was completely dry. At that point, cognitive impairment was already advanced. Although he had emergency communication equipment available, he did not initiate a full distress signal immediately. His judgment was increasingly affected by dehydration, confusion, and a distorted perception of remaining capability, leading him to underestimate the severity of his condition. Instead of calling for evacuation right away, he tries to check himself first. Just a quick self-assessment, trying to figure out how bad things really are. Then he keeps moving a bit, slowly looking for anything shade, a better spot, somewhere he might get a signal or just be able to communicate more clearly. I'm just watching him burn time here, trying small fixes when the bigger problem is already set. But that choice ends up costing time, and in that window, things start to slip even more. His thinking gets less structured, harder to organize, and the delay builds on itself, making it even tougher to respond in a clear, decisive way. As his condition worsened, he struggled to complete basic operational steps under heat stress, including focusing on instructions and maintaining attention long enough to follow through with a full emergency transmission. By the time he attempted to escalate the situation, his cognitive state had already degraded to the point where communication was fragmented and incomplete. The delay meant that when emergency services were finally contacted through a third-party viewer, responders had to rely on limited, indirect location data rather than a precise real-time distress signal. This increased the time required to narrow the search area within the Canyon system. Emergency services were alerted after a viewer contacted authorities during the live stream. Search teams launched immediately, with aerial units deployed once his last known location was confirmed through tracking data. Rescuers found him later that afternoon unconscious, showing signs of severe hyperthermia consistent with advanced heat stroke. Despite rapid cooling and evacuation to a regional hospital, his condition was irreversible, and he was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. Investigators cited multiple contributing factors, including insufficient hydration planning for Death Valley conditions, a critical navigation error that mispositioned water supplies, and delayed emergency activation. The live stream was also identified as a contributing pressure factor, influencing continued exertion despite clear signs of physiological decline. The recording later circulated widely, prompting renewed scrutiny of endurance challenges in extreme desert environments and the risks of prioritizing performance over survival limits. It was the 16th of October 2024, and the first cable cars of the morning were climbing out of the valley at Huashan, a granite mountain in north-central China whose ridgelines are so steep they look drawn rather than real. In one of those swaying cabins sat a 25-year-old American with a chest harness of camera gear, 2 phones, and a plan he'd been teasing his followers about for weeks. Below him, the cliffs of one of the most sacred mountains in the country dropped away in sheets of pale rock. He was not there for the temples, and he was not really there for the hike. He was there for roughly 15 seconds of video. His name was Dutton Stuckey. He was from Tempe, Arizona, and on TikTok he was a stunt and travel creator with a following in the thousands and ambitions far past it. His feed was a highlight reel of places most people would never stand. Rooftop edges, cliff jumps into green water, narrow ridgelines in Utah and Norway, always shot close, always with his easy grin in the corner of the frame. He was not reckless in the way people assume. He planned obsessively, scouted everything, and had never once been seriously hurt. That record was the most dangerous thing he owned. Here is the part of this story you have to sit with first. Dutton did not wake up that morning planning to gamble his life for strangers. He woke up planning content, the same as every other morning. Because when your identity, your sense of worth, and the career you are chasing all come from one app, the question is never whether a video is safe. The question is whether it will perform. Thousands of followers sounds like success to most people, but I see them as a number that'll only end up ruining you the more you obsess over it. Huashan is one of the 5 great mountains of China, a place Taoist hermits have climbed for more than 2,000 years, rising out of Shanxi province about 80 miles east of the old capital of Xi'an. It has 5 peaks, and the south peak is the highest of them, at just over 7,000 feet, a dome of bare granite with temples and stone stairways carved into it. It is a national 5A rated scenic area, the highest designation China gives, and on holiday weeks, tens of thousands of visitors a day move through its gondolas and staircases. People have been climbing this mountain on purpose for a very long time. Taoist pilgrims cut the first stairways into the granite centuries ago, some so steep they are closer to ladders, with names like the Heavenly Stairs and the Black Dragon Ridge, and to this day, porters haul drinking water and instant noodles up those same steps on shoulder poles for the summit shops. Every chain railing on the upper mountain is armored in padlocks, engraved love locks, and red ribbons left by couples and families, tens of thousands of them, a record of everyone who came up here to feel small in the good way. And bolted to the eastern face of that south peak is the reason Dutton flew across the Pacific Ocean. It is called the Changkong Plank Road, the plank walk in the sky, and it was first built by a Taoist priest more than 700 years ago, wooden boards resting on stone pegs driven into a vertical cliff. The modern version runs a little over 300 feet in 3 sections, a chiseled ledge, then a near vertical descent on iron rungs, and then the famous part, a row of wooden planks about 1 foot wide, with the rock face on one side of you and open sky on the other. And remember, it is a dead end. Whoever walks out has to turn around and come back along the same boards. Picture wooden boards about as wide as a laptop bolted to a cliff. And honestly, even that description is underselling it. The mountain knows exactly what it is selling, and it sells it carefully. At the entrance to the plank walk, attendants rent every visitor a shoulder harness for 30 yuan, about $4, with 2 short lanyards and 2 carabiners that clip onto a steel safety cable running the length of the route. The system is simple and strict. You slide both carabiners along as you move, and when you reach an anchor point, or need to get around a person coming the other way, you unclip one, move it past, clip it shut, and only then move the second. One clip is always closed. That is the entire religion of the place. The choreography of passing is the part first-timers never expect. The walk is 2-way traffic on a one-body ledge, so strangers end up chest to chest, negotiating in whatever language works, one person hugging the rock while the other steps around the outside of them over open air. Travelers' accounts are full of small horror stories. A neighbor who unclipped the wrong carabiner by mistake, a teenager filming with both hands, and at the exit, Booths will engrave you a souvenir medal for 10 yuan, announcing that you survived the plank walk in the sky. The mountain has turned its own danger into the product. The internet calls it the most dangerous hike in the world. And for years, a rumor has floated around that 100 people die on Huashan every year, a number nobody has ever confirmed and the park has never acknowledged. The truth is less cinematic. The mountain's grim reputation comes mostly from its ancient staircases in the decades before railings and cables, while the plank walk itself, with the harness system, has been remarkably controlled. The gear is worn and the operation is informal, but the math only fails when somebody takes themselves out of it. Guides will tell you the cable has worked for years precisely because nobody tests it, the same way a fence works until somebody climbs it, and in all the footage from that route, almost nobody ever had.
2 carabiners stand between every visitor and the bottom of that cliff, and I need you to remember the number 2.
Dutton had been studying that math for a different reason. There is a whole genre on these platforms. Climbers and daredevils hanging one-handed off cranes, sitting on skyscraper ledges, dangling off cliff lips with their feet swinging over nothing, and the numbers on those videos are not normal numbers. His own biggest video, a little over 1 million views, was him hanging off a sandstone edge in Utah with no rope. He knew precisely what the algorithm paid for, and it was not scenery. It was the unprotected human body in places where it should not be. I have watched hundreds of those clips researching these stories, and the cruel part is that the audience is not lying. The views are real, the sponsors are real, the career is real. The internet will happily pay a young man to stand closer and closer to the edge of his own life. It just never discusses the exchange rate.
Dangling off cliffs with no rope built entire careers on that app, and I blame every one of those accounts a little.
The views reward only the risk, never the ride home. Getting there was the easy part, and his vlogs documented all of it. The long haul across the Pacific and the connecting flight into Xi'an with his roommate and cameraman, a quiet 26-year-old named Reed Haggerty. The bullet train to Huashan North Station, barely half an hour. The shuttle bus winding half an hour up the Gorge Road to the West Peak cable car, then the cable car itself, a 20-minute ride over ravines that already had tourists gasping, and then the stone stairways toward the South Peak, through chain railings padlocked with thousands of red prayer ribbons and engraved love locks. They spent the night before in Huayin, the small city at the mountain's feet, in a hostel room with a window that framed the dark mass of the mountain blotting out the stars along the southern sky. Dutton posted a teaser that evening, his face in the dark with the lit cliffs behind him, promising his followers the most dangerous hike on Earth in the morning. Posted through the roaming data on his American phone plan, since the app does not work on Chinese networks, the clip pulled tens of thousands of views while he slept. Reed would tell investigators later, in so many words, that the trip had felt charmed up to that point. Smooth flights, perfect weather, a feed full of people telling his best friend to be careful and not meaning it. By late morning, the two of them were standing in the line for the plank walk, and the line itself is its own warning. Visitors wait on a narrow rock shelf with 2 iron chains for a railing and no harness yet, while everyone who has finished the walk squeezes back through the same bottleneck in the opposite direction. A dropped water bottle rolled past Dutton's boot while they waited, took one bounce, and went off the edge into silence. He filmed it. The caption he added later called it foreshadowing, with a laughing emoji.
Mr. Liang clips thousands of strangers onto that cable every season, and I doubt he ever forgot the one who unclipped himself.
At the front of the line, an attendant, the regulars, called Mr. Liang, had been fitting harnesses on that ledge for years. He cinched the straps across Dutton's chest, clipped both carabiners onto the cable, tugged each one twice, and gave the safety speech he gives hundreds of times a day, half in Mandarin, half in gestures, pointing at the clips, holding up one finger, then shaking his head with 2 fingers raised, one at a time, never both. Dutton nodded along, smiled for his own camera, and said something for the vlog about how the man took his job seriously. The first section eases you in, a chiseled ledge with an iron fence where everyone laughs a little too loudly. Then comes the descent, 30 feet of iron rungs hammered straight down the rock where the laughing stops and people climb down facing the cliff, clip by clip, hands going white on the chains. And then you step sideways onto the planks themselves, and the planet simply ends. 1 foot of weathered wood, polished smooth by decades of shuffling sneakers, the granite wall pressed against your shoulder, and below your heels, a drop of nearly 1,000 feet before the cliff even begins to lean back. People describe their first step onto that wood in religious terms. Knees refusing orders, hands moving on their own, and a strange tunnel quiet. The murmur of the queue gone, only wind and breath left.
His first run across those planks was completely by the book, and I wish with everything that he had just stopped there.
One safe, beautiful video was already sitting on that phone. Dutton's first pass, the one almost nobody talks about, was flawless. He went out midday with the crowds, both carabiners singing along the cable, GoPro in his teeth half the time, and did everything right. He shuffled sideways like everyone else, pressed his chest to the rock when oncoming hikers passed, moved one clip at a time around every anchor, waited his turn at the famous corner where the boards bend around the cliff. Reed filmed him from behind. The footage was beautiful. The mountain had handed him a perfectly good video. They ate instant noodles on the South Peak afterward, and Dutton scrubbed through the clips with his thumb, and the people who were with him that day say his face just slowly closed down. It looked, he said, in so many words, like every other Huashan video ever posted. Same planks, same harness, same nervous grin. There were already 100,000 of those online, filmed by Chinese tourists for Douyin, the version of the app that actually works inside China, and by every backpacker who had come through with a GoPro since the route got famous. He scrolled the mountain's hashtag right there at the table, hundreds of identical thumbnails, and the people with him remember him saying, in so many words, that being one of 100,000 was worse than never coming at all. That review session on the summit is the moment I would freeze if I could. The safe video was already on the phone. The trip was already paid for. The mountain was already conquered. His mother was already going to see it. Every single thing he came for existed by noon. What happened next was not about getting the shot. It was about getting a shot nobody else had.
Reading a comment section can do more damage than any cliff, and I mean the comments daring him to lose the rope.
His plan crystallized over that lunch, and Reed would later describe arguing against it for an hour, in so many words, and losing. They would wait until late afternoon, when the tour groups thinned out and the light went gold, and go back out a second time. Out near the far end of the planks, where the cable sags between anchors and the cliff swallows the sound, Dutton would hand his phone to Reed, and he would do the thing his comment section had been daring him to do for 2 years. He would take the harness out of the picture. Reed's side of that argument deserves to be remembered, because he made every point a safety officer would have made. He said the harness could be cropped, blurred, edited around. He said the comment section would dare him right up to the edge and then post crying emojis afterward. He said the difference between this stunt and the Utah one was that Utah had a ledge 4 feet down. And then he ran into the wall every friend of every creator runs into, which is that you cannot clip an adult to a cable against his will, and being there with him felt safer than letting him come back alone with a tripod. A few minutes past 4:30, roughly an hour before the route stopped admitting people for the day, they were back at the entrance, paying 30 yuan each for the second time that day. The ledge was nearly empty now. Mister Liang fitted the straps again, and the people behind them in line that afternoon remember him being slower about it the second time, looking at the camera rig, looking at Dutton's face, repeating the gesture with the 2 raised fingers and the shake of the head. There is no rule against walking the planks twice, and there was no rule against most of what was about to happen, because nobody had ever needed one.
Going back for a second pass near closing time tells me everything. He wanted that walkway quiet and nobody watching.
They worked their way out past the corner, past a pair of hikers heading home, to the stretch Dutton had scouted on the first pass, a quiet run of boards near the route's far end, with clean rock above and nothing below but evening haze. The sun was dropping toward the ridgelines to the west, and the cliff had turned the color of honey. Reed braced himself against the wall a few feet away, both his own carabiners locked, and started recording. Dutton looked into the lens and talked for a minute about fear being a choice. The escalation was gradual, which is the part that haunts the people who study accidents like this. First, he sat down on the edge of the planks, boots hanging over the void, both clips still closed, and that alone was a frame most creators would have flown home happy with. Then he leaned back on his palms. Then he asked Reed whether the lanyards were visible in the shot. They were. Of course they were. That is the entire point of them. 2 bright slings running from his chest to the cable-like seatbelts in a car commercial.
Passing another hiker means one clip comes off for a moment, and believe me, the second is never supposed to open.
So, he unclipped one. Click, off the cable, and he tucked the lanyard back over his shoulder, out of the frame. One carabiner still held him, which technically kept him inside the system. The same single-clip state every hiker passes through for a few seconds at every anchor point. He checked the frame again. The remaining slings still cut across the bottom of the shot, one thin line of webbing between this video and the million-view video, between looking brave and being brave. Reed told him in so many words that it looked fine. Dutton did not agree. What he wanted has a name in that corner of the internet. The free solo look. No rope, no rail, no strap, just a human being. And the air. the grammar of the most viral climbing footage ever shot. Audiences scroll past safety the way they scroll past ads. Dutton knew his comment section by heart, knew the exact phrases waiting under a harnessed video, knew the difference in the numbers, and out there on the boards, with the light perfect and the planks to themselves, all of that knowledge weighed more than the cable did.
Authenticity is the word he used for removing his own lifeline, and I've hated that word ever since.
The harness ruined the shot. That was his entire reasoning. At 7 minutes past 5 in the evening, the second carabiner came off the cable. Reed's voice on the recording goes tight, telling him this part is not worth it, asking him to clip back in, and Dutton answers the way he always answered, easy, unbothered, saying in so many words that he had climbed harder things in flip-flops, that he needed 30 seconds, that the grip was good, both lanyards were tucked behind his shoulders now. On the screen of the phone, he looked exactly like what he was pretending to be, a man on a cliff with nothing holding him because nothing was. Reed has talked about those next minutes exactly once to the police, and his account is the spine of everything we know. He stayed clipped, back against the granite, the phone in one hand and his other hand free on purpose, he said, in case. He remembers deciding that the fastest way to end the stunt was to film it well, no retakes, one clean shot, and then everybody clips in and goes down the mountain for dumplings. He remembers the wind being almost nothing. He remembers thinking the light really was perfect and hating himself for thinking it.
Both carabiners hanging open on his chest meant nothing on that mountain was holding him anymore, and it kind of makes me sick.
Then, he did the thing he had flown 8,000 miles to do. He turned to face the mountain, knelt down on the boards, took the worn front edge of the planks in both hands, and lowered his body off the walkway until he hung at full extension over the east face of the South Peak, arms straight, feet swimming gently above 1,000 feet of nothing. He looked up into the lens and grinned. On the recording, you can hear Reed breathing. Somewhere down the route, a woman who saw it later told police she assumed it was a mannequin, because no person would do that. One other person saw what happened next. A hiker from Chengdu was resting at the corner where the boards bend, close enough to see but too far to matter, and she stood frozen with both hands on the cable. Far below them, birds were cutting through the evening air against the cliff face, which is the detail she could not stop repeating to officers afterward, that there were birds flying beneath a human being's shoes. The attendant station was out of sight around the rock. There was nobody on that mountain with the authority or the reach to stop what was already in motion.
Hanging by your fingers above 1,000 feet of air for a phone is a trade I'll never understand.
Here is what was happening inside his hands during those seconds, because this is where the story was always going to be decided. A dead hang looks static, but it is a countdown. Forearm muscles locked in a closed fist burn through their fuel astonishingly fast, and the burn arrives quietly, a warmth, then a tremble, then a strange distance, like the fingers belong to someone else. The boards he gripped were not a gym bar. They were hand-worn wood, rounded at the lip, faintly gritty with dust, and his palms had been sweating since the second carabiner opened. On the recording, the hang lasts 26 seconds, and the people who have seen it say you can watch the transaction happen in his face. Second 5, the grin, the eyebrow raise, the money shot already banked. Second 12, the grin tightens at the corners as the forearms send their first invoice. Second 18, his feet stop swinging and go still, the body instinctively cutting every gram of wasted motion. And Reed's voice says, "Come up now," twice, no longer sounding like a cameraman. Second 20, Dutton starts the pull. That was supposed to be routine.
Grip strength fails quietly, not loudly, and I knew his forearms were on a countdown the second he lowered himself.
Forearms do not negotiate, they just quit. 20 seconds in, he started to pull back up, and the pull-up that had never once failed him in his life failed him for the first time in the one place it could not. His elbows bent, his chin reached the level of the planks, and then his right hand, repositioning for a higher hold on the smooth edge, slid. The recording shows his whole body drop 3 inches and catch on one arm. The grin disappeared. What replaced it, frame by frame, was the expression of a man doing arithmetic he had never planned to do, with numbers that were already finished. Pull-ups in a gym are nothing like one pull-up over a void, and I could feel his arms giving out from here. Reed moved faster than thinking. He dropped to the boards on his knees, still clipped, and lunged for the wrist that was still holding, and his fingers closed on the cuff of Dutton's jacket sleeve. For 1/2 of 1 second, there was a connection between them, nylon and fingertips, 26 years old holding 25 years old above the bottom of the world. Then, the fabric pulled through. Anyone who has studied falls will tell you that no grip in the world arrests a falling adult by a jacket cuff. It did not matter. Reed will measure that 1/2 second for the rest of his life.
Reed got 2 fingers on his friend's sleeve, and that 1/2 second is something I wouldn't wish on anyone.
At 11 minutes past 5 in the evening, Dutton Stuckey came off the plank walk in the sky. There was no scream on the recording. The witnesses all said the same impossible thing, that it happened in complete silence. Just the shape of him dropping away from the boards and growing smaller against the granite until the east face of the south peak took him out of view. He fell nearly 1,000 feet to the first broken terraces of the cliff. Nobody on that mountain could reach him, and no fall of that height leaves anything for a rescuer to do. He was gone before the echo of Reed's shout came back off the rock. Silence is what every witness on those planks described next, and I have thought about that lack of sound for weeks. The attendants cleared and closed the plank walk within minutes, and scenic area police led Reed, still clipped to the cable and unable to stand, back along the boards he had just watched his best friend leave. A recovery team reached the body at first light the next morning, far below, where the cliff finally relents into broken slopes, and the American embassy in Beijing was notified that day. His family in Arizona learned what had happened before most of his followers did. The final video was never posted. Reed handed the phone to the police, and as far as anyone knows, the footage has never left their evidence room. Hua Shan did not change after Dutton died, because it did not need to. The cable was there, the rules were there, Mr. Liang's 2 raised fingers were there, and every one of them had done its job until the moment a healthy young man methodically removed himself from all of it for a camera. What changed was the argument. Chinese outlets pointed to the country's tourist blacklist system and asked why stunt creators were still being let onto sites like this at all, and his own industry asked it too, quieter, between tributes. His account is still up. The pinned video, the one with 1 million views, is him hanging off an edge by his hands.
Banning influencers from places like this gets debated every time someone dies, and I finally understand both sides of it. The mountain kept its rules. He was the one who left them.
It was June 22nd, 2013, in Death Valley National Park. The Badlands there are a maze of clay ridges and gullies. From above, it can look flat and harmless, especially in satellite images, but on the ground, it's very different. Everything reflects heat, and the pale rock just throws it right back at you. It builds fast, and it gets intense. Meilani Cosley, she was 26, a travel and lifestyle creator based in Phoenix. She was really into desert photography, that off-grid, hidden place kind of aesthetic. Her boyfriend, Jovan Thill, 29, sometimes helped her film, but he didn't have much experience in extreme environments like that, especially not dry desert heat like Death Valley. A few weeks before the trip, Meilani finds a drone clip online of the Badlands and assumes it's something remote, like a proper backcountry hike. But in reality, it wasn't. It was shot near a roadside pullout, just a short walk from the car. I get why that mistake happens, because from above, everything in that terrain can look way more isolated than it actually is. Still, she treats it like this hidden, untouched landscape. She lines up a small sponsorship for a shoot, planning it around that golden hour light. And she doesn't really check in with park staff or fully take in just how extreme the heat can get there.
This is why I start thinking about how often people underestimate just how aggressive that heat gets.
On arrival, they carried minimal water and entered the terrain in temperatures exceeding 110 degrees Fahrenheit. What appeared as open ground quickly broke into steep gullies and narrow clay ridges, forcing repeated detours. Navigation based on a saved satellite image soon became unreliable due to a lack of stable reference points. As they moved deeper into the Badlands, the environment shifted from difficult to disorienting. Gullies deepened into narrow channels that required constant climbing, descending, and backtracking. Their position relative to the road became increasingly uncertain. Water supplies declined faster than anticipated, while early heat strain began to affect both individuals, marked by fatigue, reduced coordination, and slowed decision-making. By the middle of the afternoon, they reach what they think is the right ridge, but it's not. It's a smaller outcrop, still a few hundred meters short of their goal. From there, things get more serious. A drop-off, then more exposed terrain that's rough even in normal conditions, and worse in that heat. By this point, they're already running low on water, not just a bit low, but critical.
I'll be honest, seeing how little water they had here changes how I read everything that follows.
The ground is also just soaking up heat and throwing it back up, making everything feel even worse. This is where Meilani decides to keep going instead of turning back to the road, thinking they're close enough to finish. But that choice keeps them out longer, more climbing, more exposure, less water, and heat stress that keeps building without easing. Phil began to show clear signs of heat exhaustion, including headache, nausea, and diminished sweating. Meilani attempted to manage their remaining water, but physiological decline was already underway. Within a short period, Phil's condition progressed to heat stroke, marked by confusion and loss of coherent speech. Meilani attempted to reverse course toward the road, but the terrain no longer matched her reference points. Every route ended in dead ends or impassable gullies. As her condition worsened, she also developed symptoms of severe heat illness, including dizziness, confusion, and impaired judgment, further reducing her ability to navigate. As temperatures peaked, Phil collapsed first and became unresponsive. Milani attempted to move him into the limited shade of a gully wall, but conditions were no longer survivable in place. His condition deteriorated rapidly, and he died later that evening from hyperthermia and organ failure following prolonged exposure to extreme heat. Milani remained with him for a period of time before attempting to retrace their route toward the road for help. However, by this point, she was also experiencing advanced heat stroke symptoms, including confusion, impaired judgment, and severe dehydration. Her movement became increasingly erratic, and she lost reliable orientation within the branching drainage system.
This is one of those points where even a familiar route doesn't really exist the same way anymore. It just turns into disconnected pieces that don't line up.
She was later found in a separate section of the Badlands after collapsing during attempted self-evacuation. She died from severe hyperthermia and dehydration after prolonged exposure and heat stroke, with investigators noting that cognitive decline likely occurred while she was still attempting to navigate out rather than after sustained independent travel. Rescue teams arrived the following morning. Phil was recovered from the original shelter site, while Milani was found further along the drainage system. Both fatalities were attributed to extreme heat exposure, insufficient water supply, and delayed evacuation from hazardous terrain. An official review concluded that the incident resulted from a combination of factors, including insufficient water supply, off-trail travel in hazardous terrain, reliance on non-verified digital navigation, and delayed response to escalating heat illness. The case was later used in safety briefings highlighting how rapidly desert environments can become life-threatening when exposure, dehydration, and disorientation occur simultaneously. This happened back in September 12th of 2017, up on Half Dome in Yosemite National Park, and it involved 3 wealthy lifestyle influencers from Los Angeles who flew in for what they thought was going to be a luxury adventure content trip. They had followings built on fashion, travel, and wellness, and they came to Yosemite with one goal in mind: get the perfect sunset photo from the top of Half Dome. That was it. That was the whole plan.
Before I get into who these women were, I think it helps to understand exactly what Half Dome actually is.
A lot of people who have never been to Yosemite picture it as just another scenic walk. Well, it's not that. Half Dome rises about 8,000 to 800 feet above sea level, and the hike to the top and back covers somewhere between 14 and 16 miles, depending on which trailhead you start from. The last 400 feet of that climb is the part everyone talks about, the cable section, where 2 steel cables run straight up a slab of smooth granite at an angle steep enough that you are essentially pulling your own body weight up using your arms and shoulders. Wooden boards are bolted in at intervals so people can pause and catch their breath, but there is nothing soft about that climb. The rangers who worked that day later admitted that they got a bad feeling almost the second these 3 showed up at the trailhead. Not because they looked unfit or unprepared in an obvious way, but because nothing about their approach matched what Half Dome actually demands.
And look, here's the thing that bothers me about a 400-foot wall of granite with steel cables bolted into it. It doesn't care who you are or how many followers you have.
It treats a movie star and a first-time tourist exactly the same way. That should have been obvious to anyone planning a trip there, and somehow it was not obvious to 3 people who built entire careers on planning trips.
I've looked into a handful of other Half Dome cable incidents while researching this episode,
and one detail comes up again and again in the official guidance the park puts out every single season. Rangers specifically tell visitors not to attempt the cables if there is any chance they will still be up there after the sun goes down, because the route has no lighting, no rescue access in the dark, and almost no margin for a single misstep. That warning is printed on signs at the trailhead, repeated by rangers stationed along the route, and posted on the park's own website months before anyone even books a flight. None of that information is hidden or hard to find. These 3 simply never went looking for it. Kaya Park, 26, was a luxury travel influencer known for prioritizing visually impressive content over practical planning. Coming from a wealthy background, she had a reputation for taking risks to get unique photos. She had spent months planning a specific Half Dome sunset photo, studying other summit images, and carefully preparing her outfit and lighting for the shot.
That detail about studying other people's photos for 6 months tells you that she spent more time planning the aesthetics of this shot than she spent actually learning anything about the mountain itself.
6 months of Pinterest boards and 0 minutes reading a single Park Service safety bulletin. That is not a small gap in preparation. That is the entire preparation missing. It also tells you something about how Kaya approached risk in general, not just on this trip. People who knew her described a pattern where she would scout a location entirely through other people's photos, and then assume that if someone else got the shot safely, she could too, without asking what conditions that other person was hiking in, what time they started, or what gear they were carrying. Copying someone's finished photo is not the same as copying their planning, and that distinction seems to have been completely lost on her going into this trip. The second woman was 25 years old Noah Rosen. She was a fitness and wellness influencer, the type who posted constantly about discipline, endurance, and mental toughness. She had done plenty of difficult workouts and short hikes, and she genuinely believed that being physically fit could get you through almost any outdoor challenge.
The problem I found was that she had basically no experience with long alpine-style climbs, the kind where conditions change fast and the terrain doesn't care how strong your legs are.
Throughout this whole ordeal, Noah became the group's main voice of confidence whenever anyone raised a concern, and that confidence ended up being incredibly dangerous.
What gets me about Noah specifically is the mismatch between her brand and her actual skill set.
Kaya's entire brand was built around pushing through discomfort and refusing to quit. That mindset works in a controlled gym environment, but it does not necessarily apply to a mountain. She repeatedly dismissed warnings during the climb, suggesting she viewed every obstacle as something that could be overcome through determination, rather than recognizing that some risks require caution instead of persistence. The third woman was 24-year-old Catalina. She was a fashion and lifestyle influencer focused on luxury brands and curated travel photography. Out of the three of them, she had the least hiking experience by far, and she leaned heavily on Kaya and Noah whenever a decision needed to be made outdoors.
From what I understand, she agreed to the Half Dome climb mostly because the summit shot just fit the visual style she wanted for her page. She wasn't someone who wanted to be there for the challenge, she wanted to be there for the content. Of the three women, Catalina is the one I keep thinking about differently than the other two.
She was not the one pushing for the climb, and she was not the one arguing with rangers. She just trusted that the other two had this handled because they sounded so sure of themselves all day.
I think that's the most relatable mistake in this entire story.
Most of us have been the third person in a group, the one who goes along because everyone else seems confident, and most of the time that works out fine. This time it did not, and that gap between most of the time and this time is exactly what makes outdoor accidents so brutal. Catalina had the least outdoor experience in the group, leaving her with no real basis to judge whether the other's confidence was informed or reckless. Unlike Kaya and Noah, she couldn't distinguish between genuine expertise and misplaced assurance driven by social media goals. By the time she might have realized the difference, it was already too late. They arrived at the trailhead much later than recommended. Rangers notice immediately that their schedule makes little sense, because most people attempting Half Dome start before sunrise. These three did not start until late morning. A ranger at the base told them directly that they were starting dangerously late, that they should expect to be descending long before sunset, and that Half Dome simply was not a sunset destination for hikers without serious experience. The women laughed and explained that they were used to extreme travel. One ranger later recalled that this was the exact moment he realized these three did not understand where they actually were. A late morning start on a 14-mile round trip is not a small scheduling error. It is close to giving away half the daylight before you have taken a single step.
And the laugh is the part I can't get past. You can forgive someone for not knowing the mileage or the elevation gain off the top of their head.
It is much harder to forgive someone for being told directly by a trained ranger that their plan is dangerous and responding with a laugh instead of a single follow-up question.
I think about what a single follow-up question would have actually cost them at that moment.
Something as simple as asking how many hours the round trip typically takes, or whether other hikers ever attempt a sunset summit and what happens to them on the way down. That question takes 10 seconds to ask and could have completely changed the rest of the day. Instead, they treated a direct safety warning from a uniformed professional the same way they might treat an unsolicited comment from a stranger online, something to brush past rather than something to actually weigh. When the rangers later went through what these women actually packed, it painted a pretty clear picture of where their priorities were. They brought multiple outfit changes, several pounds of camera gear, tripods, cosmetic bags, portable lighting equipment, and battery packs for all of it. What they left behind was almost unbelievable. No headlamps, not enough water for a hike of that length, no emergency layers for when the temperature drops at elevation once the sun goes down, no backup batteries for actual navigation equipment, just for their cameras and lights. They apparently assumed their smartphone flashlights would be enough to get them down a vertical granite face in total darkness if it came to that. A headlamp costs about $20 and weighs next to nothing. An extra liter of water adds maybe 2 pounds to a pack that already had several pounds of camera equipment stuffed into it. So this was not a weight problem, and it was not a cost problem. This was three women deciding, without ever saying it out loud, that the equipment for capturing the moment mattered more than the equipment for surviving it. That is the single packing list detail that tells you everything about how this day was framed before it even started.
I went back and forth on whether to call this an oversight or a decision, because oversight makes it sound accidental, like nobody thought about it.
But three separate people packed three separate bags for this trip, and not one of them flagged a headlamp as worth bringing, while all three somehow agreed that portable lighting rigs for video were essential. That is not an accident. That tells you what each of them, independently, considered a priority for this day, and survival gear simply did not make the list. The hike becomes a content production day instead of a climb. Every major viewpoint becomes a photo shoot, an outfit change, video shoots for social media, multiple retakes. At Vernal Fall, they stopped for 45 minutes. At Nevada Fall, nearly an hour. At Little Yosemite Valley, another extended break for sponsored content. By mid-afternoon, they were already behind schedule. Add that up with me for a second. 45 minutes, then close to 60, then another extended stop on top of that. That is somewhere around 2.5 hours burned on photography alone before they even reach the halfway point of the climb, and none of that includes the actual walking time. A normal round trip for an early starting, steady hiker takes somewhere between 10 and 12 hours total. These three spent almost a quarter of that entire budget on tripod angles before they had gone half the distance. And the part that should scare you is that the hardest section, the cables, was still completely ahead of them.
What really gets me is that none of these three stops happened at locations where stopping made any logical sense from a safety standpoint.
Vernal Fall and Nevada Fall are beautiful, sure, but they are also exactly the kind of spot where a long pause eats directly into the cushion you need for the summit attempt later. A smart group plans its long stops near the beginning of a trip when there is daylight to spare and keeps things moving once the harder terrain starts. This group did the opposite without seeming to notice, treating every waterfall like it existed in its own bubble with no connection to the hours ticking away on the rest of the route. A backcountry ranger encounters them near Subdome. He notices their pace, their equipment, and the amount of remaining daylight. He strongly recommends turning around immediately, skipping the summit, and returning another day. He explains that sunset photography is not worth descending the cables in darkness. Kaya insists they only need a few pictures. The ranger is unconvinced. A few pictures is doing a lot of work in that sentence, and it is worth sitting with for a second. A few pictures implies a quick stop, in and out, nothing that should cost real time. But we already know from Vernal Fall and Nevada Fall that a few pictures for this group meant 45 minutes minimum. Kaya was not lying to the ranger exactly. She was lying to herself about what a few pictures had actually been costing them all day. And that self-deception is a much harder thing to argue someone out of than a simple misunderstanding.
I find it interesting that the ranger near Subdome didn't just repeat the generic safety message every hiker gets at the trailhead.
He looked specifically at their pace and their gear before forming his recommendation, which tells me he was reading the situation in real time rather than just reciting a script. That is a more informed warning than the first one they received, built on actual evidence of how the day had gone so far, and it still did not land any harder than the first warning had. The climb is taking much longer than expected, and signs of trouble emerge. Catalina is exhausted, water supplies are running low, Noah develops leg cramps. Several hikers descending warn them they are cutting it too close. They dismiss every concern. Noah repeatedly says they are almost there, despite the fact that they still have the hardest section ahead. I want to single out the leg cramps specifically, because that is not a vague feeling of being tired. That is your body sending a very concrete signal that it is running low on water and electrolytes. Cramps at altitude on a long climb are the kind of thing a hiking guide would treat as a hard stop, not a minor inconvenience to push through. Noah, the fitness influencer, whose whole brand was built around understanding her own body, either did not recognize what cramping actually meant, or recognized it and decided the summit mattered more anyway. Neither option reflects well on someone whose entire platform is built on physical expertise. And it was not only their own bodies sending warning signs. Hikers who had already summited and were heading back down took the time to stop and tell them directly that they were cutting things too close, which means strangers, with no reason to lie and nothing to gain, were independently reaching the same conclusion as the rangers. When your own cramping legs, your dwindling water supply, and total strangers coming down the mountain are all telling you the same thing at the same time, that is not a single data point you can dismiss. That is three unrelated sources of information all converging, and converging warnings like that almost never turn out to be wrong. Noah's repeated line that they were almost there is also worth examining on its own, because almost there can mean wildly different things depending on what is actually left to cover. From where they were standing, the remaining distance was short in terms of feet, but the remaining difficulty was the steepest, most exposed section of the entire route. Measuring how close you are by distance instead of by difficulty is exactly the kind of error that turns a hard day into a fatal one, and it is an error a more experienced alpine hiker would never have made. At the cable section, they stop repeatedly, take photos while climbing, film social media videos, and hold poses while other hikers wait. Several hikers become irritated. One warns them that this is not the place to be messing around. The women continue, and their summit arrival is delayed even further. The cables only fit one direction of traffic comfortably at a time, which means every pose they held was not just slowing themselves down, it was forcing strangers behind them to dangle on a steel cable bolted into granite while waiting for an outfit check. That is the moment in the story where this stops being purely about their own risk tolerance and starts putting other people in an uncomfortable, exposed position against their will.
I don't think the women were trying to be reckless towards strangers. I think that they had simply stopped noticing that other people existed on the route at all.
There is a specific kind of tunnel vision that comes from being on camera, where the people standing just outside the frame stop registering as real obstacles to consider. I imagine that is exactly what happened here. Every pause for a photo probably felt, in the moment, like it was costing 30 seconds, when in reality, each one was forcing a line of strangers to stand still on an exposed cable route with nothing but a steel wire between them and a very long fall. The frustrated hiker who finally spoke up was not being rude. He was pointing out something that should have been obvious from the very first pose. Near the summit, a ranger descending gives what becomes the final warning. He explains that they need to leave almost immediately, that darkness comes quickly, the granite becomes difficult to navigate, and temperatures are dropping. He tells them plainly that staying for sunset is going to create a serious problem getting down. They assure him they will leave soon. 3 rangers, 3 separate locations along the route, 3 independent warnings, all saying some version of the same thing without ever coordinating with each other. That consistency is the part I keep coming back to. When 3 different professionals who have never spoken to each other that day all reach the identical conclusion within a span of a few hours, that is not caution, that is a pattern being read correctly by everyone except the 3 people it actually applied to. I think it is also worth noticing how the tone of these warnings escalated as the day went on. The first ranger at the trailhead was informative, almost matter-of-fact. The second one near Subdome was firmer, specifically recommending they turn around. By the time the third ranger caught them near the summit, he was described as unusually direct, going out of his way to spell out exactly what kind of problem they would face. That escalation is not rangers becoming more dramatic for no reason. That is professionals adjusting their language in real time because the danger genuinely kept increasing with every hour that passed, and each one of them could see it clearly even from a single brief encounter. Once on top, the summit becomes an outdoor studio. Outfit changes continue, tripods are repositioned dozens of times, hundreds of photos are taken, video filming consumes even more time. The sun begins dropping, other hikers leave. The summit gradually empties, the women remain.
The summit gradually empties is the detail I would put at the center of this whole episode if I had to pick just one.
Every single other person standing on that rock looked at the same fading light and made the same calculation and walked away. That is not a ranger giving advice that could be dismissed as overly cautious. That is dozens of ordinary strangers, with no authority and nothing to gain from being right, all independently voting with their feet. Watching that happen around you and still staying for more shots is choosing to ignore the clearest, least biased warning available that day. Picture the actual scene for a second. A crowded summit at golden hour, dozens of people taking in the same view, and then slowly, group by group, the crowd starts thinning out as people head for the cables while there is still usable light. By the time the sun is actually setting, the 3 of them are likely standing in a space that used to be packed and is now mostly empty, with maybe a handful of stragglers left. That kind of visual should hit differently than any verbal warning, because it requires no interpretation at all. It is just math playing out in front of your eyes. And somehow, it still was not enough. Sunset arrives. The photographs look incredible. The women celebrate. But now, the trail is almost empty, the cables are below them, and darkness is spreading across the granite. One hiker heading down urges them to follow. They stay behind for just a few more shots. That decision ultimately seals their fate. I keep replaying that phrase, just a few more shots, because by this point in the day, it had already been said in some form at least 4 separate times at Vernal Fall, at Nevada Fall, on the cables, and now here at the summit with no daylight left to spend. It worked as an excuse every previous time because there had always been enough daylight cushion left to absorb the cost. This was the first time it was said with absolutely no cushion remaining, and nobody in the group seemed to register that the math had finally run out. This is also where I think the hiker who urged them to follow deserves more credit than he probably ever got. He had no obligation to say anything at all. He could have just kept walking down, focused on his own descent, and nobody would have blamed him for it. Instead, he stopped, specifically addressed them, and tried to get them moving while there was still a sliver of usable light left. That is one more independent voice added to a pile of warnings that already included 3 rangers and a thinning summit crowd, and it still was not enough to change their minds. By the time they reach the cables, the sun is gone. Moonlight is limited. Their phones are already losing battery. The granite surface is difficult to see. The steel cables disappear into darkness below. Several descending hikers pass using proper headlamps. The women are struggling to make out the route ahead. Panic begins to replace confidence. Granite holds heat from the sun during the day, and then cools fast once the sun sets, which means condensation can start forming on the surface right around the time these 3 were finally descending, on top of failing phone batteries and 0 headlamps between them. Every single piece of bad luck stacking up in this paragraph traces directly back to a choice made hours earlier. The condensation was always going to happen at that hour. The only variable that changed was whether a hiker was still on the cables when it did, and that variable was entirely in their control. What makes this paragraph so hard to read is that none of these individual problems would have mattered much on their own. Limited moonlight alone is manageable with a headlamp. A dying phone battery alone is manageable if it is not your only light source. Slick granite alone is manageable if you can actually see where your feet are landing. It was the combination of all 4 happening at once, stacked directly on top of each other, that turned a difficult descent into an impossible one. And every one of those 4 factors traces back to a decision that could have been made differently earlier in the day. Kaya reaches a congested section of the cables. Attempting to let another climber pass, she steps outside the designated path. Her shoe loses traction on smooth granite. Witnesses hear a scream. She disappears over the edge. Noah instinctively reaches toward her, shifts her weight forward while trying to look over the edge, and loses her grip on the cable. She falls seconds later. Catalina remains frozen on the cables for several minutes, then attempts to descend alone, slips on moisture forming on the cooling granite, and slides off a steep section below the main cable route. I am not going to dramatize this any further than I already have, because 3 people lost their lives within a span of just a few minutes, and that deserves to be treated with weight, rather than turned into a spectacle. What I will say is that almost every factor in this sequence, the darkness, the congestion, the wet granite, the panic, had been predicted out loud by rangers hours earlier in the day. Rangers launched a search operation overnight, but darkness prevented immediate recovery efforts, and search teams already feared the worst because of where the falls occurred. At first light, all 3 bodies were located below separate sections of the route, and phones containing hundreds of summit photographs were recovered. None contained images of the descent. Several rangers later stated privately that they had expected an accident long before sunset, not because the women were unlucky, but because every warning they received throughout the day had been ignored, and each bad decision pushed them closer to a situation that experienced hikers spend years learning to avoid. The thing I keep landing on after putting this whole episode together is that nobody failed to warn them. 3 rangers tried, dozens of strangers tried just by leaving when they left, and the math of a fading sunset tried in its own quiet way the entire afternoon. The only thing missing that day was someone inside that group willing to value a warning over a photograph, even just once. It was October 5th, 2021. The Grapevine Mountains in Death Valley National Park formed a remote canyon system of fractured volcanic rock and narrow drainages, where small navigation errors could quickly lead to isolation due to distance and lack of visible reference. Points once off the main track. Theo Barsanti, 41, was a California-based documentary creator running a YouTube channel focused on abandoned sites, mining history, and forgotten infrastructure. While experienced in basic exploration, his recent work had increasingly become audience-driven, with expeditions shaped by viewer interest, narrative structure, and production timelines rather than purely logistical caution. For months, Barsanti had been pursuing a potential forgotten mining structure based on early 20th century archival photographs. After narrowing its possible location through historical mapping, he identified a remote canyon system in Death Valley as the most likely site. He framed the expedition for his audience as a discovery-focused field mission. Honestly, I'd already be cautious here because once a route is built off historical fragments like this, there's a lot of room for gaps between the map and the actual ground. Although presented as carefully planned, key decisions were influenced by content timing and narrative continuity. The destination was only generally disclosed, preserving suspense for later release. He departed before sunrise, reaching the canyon approach via a rough four-wheel drive track. His vehicle was not well suited for sustained off-road conditions, but he proceeded under the assumption that the route would remain passable based on limited prior reconnaissance and earlier satellite reference points. Looking at this, I am already uneasy about relying on assumption in terrain like that. As the track deteriorated, repeated impacts and uneven terrain caused mechanical strain, eventually leading to a tire failure. After a temporary roadside repair, he continued deeper rather than retreating, influenced by time pressure and the expectation of reaching the target site within daylight hours. At a narrowing section of the access route, the vehicle became high-centered in an erosion channel and could not be moved in either direction. He was stranded several miles from his intended staging point with limited water, no reliable communication, and a destination still farther inside the canyon system. At this point, Barsanti made a critical decision, influenced by both logistical pressure and content continuity. He abandoned the vehicle and continued on foot while documenting the situation. This marked the transition from planned travel to unsupported backcountry movement. Initial foot travel was slow but manageable as he entered the drainage system. However, the canyon quickly split into multiple visually similar branches, making route tracking increasingly uncertain. Without stable signal or reliable landmarks, navigation depended on memory and intermittent visual cues from earlier filming. By midday, he reached the mining site he had been searching for, wooden structural remnants and stone foundations built into the canyon wall. The discovery confirmed his research and became a key content milestone. He spent extended time filming and photographing the site, gradually consuming less water than conditions required. This reduced his reserves earlier than planned for the return journey. After completing documentation, he began his return. However, the canyon's branching structure created subtle directional errors, and he soon entered unfamiliar drainage paths. The loss of phone power eliminated digital navigation, forcing reliance on visual memory under increasing heat stress. As he retraced his steps, repeated dead ends, forced backtracking, increasing exertion, and delaying progress, fatigue accumulated, and dehydration and heat exposure began to significantly impair judgment of distance, time, and direction. I just keep picturing him looping back through the same dry cuts and not realizing how much ground that actually adds up to. During a descent over unstable talus, he slipped and sustained a severe ankle injury that sharply reduced mobility. The injury turned a routine return into a prolonged and physically demanding exit through unstable terrain, increasing exertion, and accelerating fluid loss. As daylight faded, he briefly re-established visual recognition of a known ridgeline and managed to reach his vehicle in the early evening, significantly dehydrated, injured, and in clear physiological distress. After restoring limited phone functionality using remaining battery reserves, he contacted his spouse and transmitted his location, prompting an emergency response. A ranger unit was dispatched and arrived after a delay due to distance, road conditions, and limited nighttime access. He was found in the vehicle in critical condition, showing signs consistent with severe exertional heat stroke. Despite immediate field treatment and rapid evacuation toward medical care, his condition deteriorated during transport due to progressive hyperthermia and multi-system failure. He was pronounced dead shortly after arrival at a medical facility. In the aftermath, investigators identified cumulative risk factors including limited route sharing, solo travel, extended content capture periods, and reliance on incomplete communication redundancy. The incident was later cited in discussions on influencer-driven fieldwork, where production pressure and narrative continuity were identified as contributing factors in operational decision-making under hazardous desert conditions. August 9th, 2019. The Havasupai Reservation in northwestern Arizona sits deep inside a canyon system, where the landscape itself becomes part of the danger. Massive sandstone walls rise hundreds of feet on either side and trap heat instead of letting it escape. By mid-morning in August, temperatures on the canyon floor regularly climb above 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Those temperatures are recorded on the main trail where there are water sources and other hikers nearby. Getting into Havasupai is not as simple as buying a ticket at the entrance. Visitors need a permit that must be secured months in advance through the tribe's online reservation system. Most years, the available permits are gone within hours. The system is not only meant to limit the number of visitors, the canyon is remote, rescue resources are limited, and officials rely on permit records to know who is in the backcountry and roughly where they should be.
If someone enters without a permit, they're not on any official record. No one's expecting them, and if they don't come back, no one knows to start looking.
By 2019, this was not obscure information. The permit process had been discussed for years on hiking forums, travel blogs, and social media. Anyone who had seriously looked into visiting Havasupai would have known that permits were required. The trip was Sean Falco's idea. He was 26 and had built a fitness page posting workout videos, physique updates, and travel content that framed everything as an adventurous lifestyle. After they missed out on permits, he was the one who suggested going anyway. He was fit, confident, and used to being the most capable person in any room, and he carried that same assumption into environments that had nothing to do with a gym. The strongest athlete of the group was Drew Tilden. He was 25, Sean's closest friend, faster and fitter than most people around him. He had enough outdoor experience to feel comfortable in most situations, but not enough to appreciate how different this canyon could be. He agreed to Sean's plan without much hesitation. Alaya Reeves had wanted to shoot Havasupai for over a year. She was 24 and had been dating Sean for about that long too. Her page focused almost entirely on carefully edited travel and lifestyle photos, and Havasupai had come up more than once in her content plans. The location was as much her motivation for the trip as anything else. The youngest of the four, Cassidy Weston, had never done a backcountry hike before. She was 23 and had been close friends with Alaya since high school. She came because Alaya asked her to, and because on paper, it sounded like an adventure.
Confidence can be surprisingly contagious. Once one person sounds like they know what they're doing, it's a lot easier for everyone around them to go along with it.
The canyon holds onto heat in a way that catches many people off guard. The sandstone walls absorb heat throughout the day and slowly release it after sunset, so temperatures stay high long after the sun goes down. Airflow is limited, and even standing in the shade offers less relief than most people expect, because the surrounding rock continues radiating heat. The human body cools itself by sweating. As sweat evaporates, it carries heat away from the skin. That system only works as long as the body has enough fluid to keep producing sweat. As dehydration sets in, sweat production slows. Once that happens, body temperature begins to rise. The early warning signs can seem minor. A headache, nausea, dizziness, or simply feeling off are easy to brush aside. By the time those symptoms become obvious, the body is often already struggling to keep up. In a canyon that can reach 110 degrees with little airflow and limited shade, that decline can happen much faster than people realize.
I've heard people describe desert hiking as a game of just staying ahead of your own body. Once your body starts falling behind, there's often no quick way to fix it.
Beyond the main Havasu Creek route, an unauthorized side canyon becomes far more rugged. The trails are unmaintained, and much of the terrain is made up of loose, fractured sandstone. From a distance, the rock can look solid. Up close, it is often anything but. Sections that appear stable can break away under a person's weight without warning, and the fracture lines that weaken the rock are usually impossible to see from the surface. Sean had looked into Havasupai permits months before the trip. He knew how it worked, knew when it opened, and knew they had missed their chance after it sold out. Instead of giving up, he spent time reading hiking forums and scrolling through location-tagged posts from people who admitted they had gone in without permits and had no problems. He found enough stories to convince himself the risk was worth taking. He told the others they could probably get onto the trail before anyone questioned whether they had a reservation, and that the worst-case scenario was simply being turned around at the entrance. He sounded confident because he had done research. It just was not the kind of research that accounted for what could happen if something went wrong.
I think we've all fallen into this trap at some point. If enough people say, I did it and nothing happened, it starts feeling a lot safer than it actually is.
Their early start was part of the plan. They drove through the night hoping to reach the trail before anyone questioned whether they had a reservation. By 4:30 in the morning, they were already hiking by headlamp. No one stopped them. For a moment, it probably felt like all the research had paid off. They were carrying more gear than any of them were used to hiking with. Sean and Drew split the drone case and gimbal between their packs, even though drones were prohibited on the reservation without prior approval. Alaya carried 2 camera bodies along with a portable lighting panel. Cassidy carried most of the shared supplies, including water, snacks, and a basic first aid kit that none of them had much experience using. The weight added up quickly, although no one seemed concerned about it.
I doubt any of them were thinking about conserving energy that morning. The gear probably felt like an investment, not something that would eventually work against them.
As they made their way along the permitted section of the trail, they passed other hikers who had also started before sunrise to avoid the worst of the heat. Everyone kept moving. No one questioned why the group was there. At about 6:15 that morning, the group reached a sign marking a side canyon as closed to visitors. Cassidy slowed down long enough to read it and glanced at the others. Sean kept walking without stopping. Drew followed him. Aliyah was looking at her phone, checking the location tag she wanted for photos. After a moment, Cassidy followed them. By then, the temperature had already climbed to 86 degrees Fahrenheit, and the hottest part of the day was still hours away.
It's easy to look at 86 degrees and think, yeah, we're still good. The worst of the heat isn't here yet. Sometimes that's exactly when you're falling behind.
Aliyah had found the exact spot she wanted through a geotagged post from another creator. It was a section of an unauthorized side canyon about 2 miles off the main route, where the morning sun hit the sandstone at just the right angle. That was the destination. Sean's plan was simple. They would get there, film what they needed, and make it back to the main trail before the hottest part of the day. The terrain changed almost as soon as they left the main trail. The maintained trail disappeared, replaced by uneven rock shelves, loose stone, and sections where every step demanded attention. Within the first half mile, the drone case was already becoming a problem. It was bulky and awkward to carry. As Drew squeezed through a narrow section, it caught against the canyon wall and threw him off balance on a patch of loose scree. He caught himself, adjusted the case across his back, and kept going. Sean was already several yards ahead. Cassidy stayed at the back of the group. Unlike the others, she watched every step before putting her weight down. On one short scramble, she stopped completely, studied the route for a moment, and waited until Drew had made it to the top before climbing after him. The others kept moving and never looked back. They reached the location at around 9 that morning. The light was exactly what Aliyah had hoped for. The early sun lit the upper canyon wall and reflected down into the narrow canyon below. She immediately started directing the shoot. Sean set up the gimbal while Drew launched the drone. Before long, everyone was focused on getting the next shot. They stayed there for nearly 2 hours. They weren't just taking a few pictures. They kept moving to different spots, reviewing footage, waiting for the light to shift, and redoing shots they thought could look better. Before long, the morning had slipped away.
I can imagine someone saying, let's get one more shot. And nobody's thinking about what another 15 minutes might change.
During that time, they drank water regularly. It did not seem excessive. It was simply what anyone would do while hiking and filming in that kind of heat. But no one was paying attention to how much water they had left. Around 10:30, Cassidy picked up one of the shared bottles, noticed how light it felt, and quietly put it back down. The others were setting up another shot, and she did not want to interrupt. Instead, she finished what remained in her own bottle. By then, they'd already been hiking and filming for more than 6 hours. Even if they'd started with what seemed like plenty of water, they were going through it much faster than they'd expected. They were also eating protein bars throughout the morning. They were calorie-dense and familiar to all of them, but digesting food in extreme heat requires additional fluid. On its own, that would not have made much difference. Combined with the miles they had already covered, the heavy packs, and hours of constant heat, it became one more demand on bodies that were already under stress. By 11 o'clock, the temperature on the canyon floor was approaching 108 degrees. They had spent more than 4 hours surrounded by direct sunlight and heat radiating off the canyon walls. None of them were dressed for those conditions. They were wearing the same athletic clothes they normally wore to the gym or for fitness content. No one had a wide-brimmed hat, lightweight sun protective clothing, or anything that would have provided meaningful protection in an Arizona canyon in August. There's a big difference between dressing for comfort and dressing for conditions. The canyon wasn't exactly handing out bonus points for looking good, though. Instead of turning around, Sean suggested going farther. He had seen another location online, a narrow slot canyon about 1.5 miles deeper into the route. He said they could get a few more shots there before heading back. He said it with the same confidence he had shown all morning, as though the decision had already been made. Drew mentioned that the heat was getting to him. Sean acknowledged it, but kept packing up the gear. Aliyah was already looking at the route farther south on her phone, comparing the terrain ahead to the photos she had saved. She did not say much either way. Cassidy quietly suggested that they should start heading back. She was not arguing or trying to stop anyone. She simply thought they had gone far enough. Sean replied that they were already there, and it did not make sense to leave without getting everything they had come for. Drew had already shouldered his pack. Aliyah started walking. After a brief pause, Cassidy picked up her pack and followed. The stretch between the two locations was the most difficult part of the route so far. The scrambling became steeper, and the sandstone underfoot was looser and less predictable. They moved much more slowly than they had earlier that morning. They stopped more often, spoke less, and spent most of the hike focused on where to place their feet. Every mile made the heat harder to deal with. The heavy packs, The hours of hiking and the water they had already lost were all beginning to catch up with them.
I don't think this part looked anything like the trip they pictured. It sounds more like they were grinding through it than really enjoying it.
Around noon, Cassidy said she had a pounding headache and felt like she might throw up. Sean told her to drink some water and keep moving. She unscrewed her bottle, looked inside, and realized there was barely anything left. Someone checked for a phone signal. There was none. They kept going. Nobody suggested stopping for long. At that point, they still believed they could get the last location and be heading back soon. They reached the Slot Canyon around 12:30. By then, all four of them were clearly feeling the effects of the heat. They were moving slowly, sitting down whenever they had the chance, and speaking very little. Between the four of them, they had less than a quarter of their water remaining. It started with Drew. On the eastern side of the Slot Canyon was a sandstone ledge about 15 feet above the ground. It offered a clear view across the canyon, and Drew climbed toward it without much hesitation. From below, nothing about the ledge stood out as especially dangerous, especially to someone with Drew's experience. He reached the top, raised his camera, and shifted his weight. The rock beneath him suddenly gave way. There was no loud crack or obvious warning. The entire section, roughly 4 feet across, broke free all at once. Sandstone can fail that way because the fractures that weaken it often run deep inside the rock and cannot be seen from the surface. Drew fell with the collapsing slab. He landed on his feet first, then slammed onto his left side before his head struck the canyon floor. Part of the broken rock came down on top of him. His left leg absorbed most of the impact. The tibia snapped with enough force that the broken bone pushed through the skin just below his knee. The rest of the fall left him with serious blunt force injuries to his left shoulder and the left side of his head. By the time Sean and Aliyah reached him, he was still conscious, but he was confused and unable to respond clearly. He could only make incoherent sounds, and the area around his left eye was already beginning to swell shut. They managed to lift the rock slab off Drew, but there was little else they could do. Cassidy stayed back near the canyon wall, while Sean and Aliyah tried to assess his injuries. None of them had any real medical training. They had nothing sturdy enough to splint his leg, no way to stabilize his head, and no safe way to move him without risking even more damage. Sean pulled out his phone. There was no signal. Drew's phone had been thrown from his pack during the fall. The drone controller had GPS, but it could not contact anyone. The temperature had climbed to 111 degrees Fahrenheit. They were about 2.5 miles beyond the main route in an unmaintained side canyon. There was no marked trail, no shade structures, and no one else anywhere nearby. Because they had entered the reservation without a valid permit, no one outside the group had any official record that they were there.
That detail really got to me. This is why permits matter more than most people realize. Imagine needing help that badly and nobody even knows they're supposed to be looking for you.
There were not many options. Carrying Drew out over that terrain was not realistic, and staying put meant waiting with no way to call for help. Sean made the call. Sean decided that he and Cassidy would head back for help while Aliyah stayed with Drew. Before leaving, Sean propped his backpack against a large rock near Drew so it would be easy to spot from a distance. He took one of the 2 remaining water bottles and left the other with Aliyah. Sean and Cassidy started back just after 1 that afternoon. Sean pushed ahead, stopping whenever Cassidy fell too far behind, but every stretch of exposed rock was taking more out of him. Within about 20 minutes, Cassidy began falling behind. She was no longer sweating the way she had been earlier. When Sean reached out to steady her across a loose section of rock, her skin felt hot and unusually dry. She walked with slow, careful steps and barely spoke. At first, it looked as though she was simply concentrating on the difficult terrain. Soon it became obvious that something else was wrong. Sean was still moving faster than she was. He had been in better physical condition from the start, and he had gone through slightly less water during the morning. Even so, the heat was taking its toll on him as well. He would get ahead, stop to wait for Cassidy, then start moving again. About 40 minutes into the return hike, Cassidy lowered herself onto a flat rock in an exposed section of the canyon with no shade. She said she just needed a minute. Sean handed her the last of the water he was carrying and waited. The bottle was empty after that. After a short rest, she stood up and they continued. 10 minutes later, she sat down again. This time, her breathing was noticeably different. It was quick, shallow, and uneven. Her face had turned a deep red, and when Sean asked if she was okay, she answered slowly. Her words no longer matched his questions. She was still awake and sitting upright, but she was clearly becoming confused. Sean stayed with Cassidy for a while before deciding he had to keep moving if anyone was going to get help. Nearby, he found a small rock overhang that offered the only patch of shade in that stretch of canyon. He helped her into it. He leaned the empty bottle against the rock where it could be seen and left his phone beside her even though it had no signal. Then he continued on alone with nothing but the clothes he was wearing. The remaining hike back to the permitted trail was about 1.5 miles. It took him nearly 1.5 hours to cover it. He moved slowly, stopping often and staying as close to the canyon wall as he could whenever there was even a little shade. By the time he reached a section of trail where a small group of hikers was making their way out, he was in serious distress. He made it as far as a flat section of rock near the trail edge before he stopped moving. A small group of hikers found him there. He was conscious enough to respond when they spoke to him, but could not stand and could not give a clear location for the others. Over the next several minutes, he stopped responding to their voices. He died before emergency responders reached him.
It was the first time anyone outside the group even knew they were in the canyon. There was no permit on file, no entry record, and no expected return time that would have flagged anything as wrong.
The information had to be passed along through others before it reached emergency responders. By then, nearly 2 hours had passed since Drew's fall. Responders arrived to find Sean where the hikers had left him, still in the same position on the rock. Rescuers still faced several more hours before they could reach the group. Ground teams had to make their way through the same unmarked, unmaintained terrain in the same extreme heat, with only a rough idea of where the others might be. The canyon walls were too narrow for a direct landing in most sections, and the extreme heat made flying conditions difficult, so ground teams had to cover much of the distance on foot. There was simply no fast way to reach the group. Back at the Slot Canyon, Elijah was alone with Drew. Since the fall, he had drifted in and out of consciousness. At times, he seemed to recognize her voice. A few minutes later, he would stop responding again. She used the little water she had left to wet his lips and cool his face, hoping to keep him responsive for as long as possible. Sometime during the afternoon, he stopped responding altogether. Elijah stayed beside him in the narrow strip of shade along the canyon wall. As the afternoon wore on, even that patch of shade slowly shrank. By then, she had no water left. She had already exhausted herself trying to help Drew after the fall, and now she was sitting for hours in a canyon where the temperature remained well above 100 degrees. There was nowhere she could realistically go, no way to call for help, and no way of knowing whether anyone was even looking for them yet. By mid-afternoon, the narrow strip of shade along the canyon wall had disappeared completely. What happened after that was reconstructed from the scene. At some point, Elijah had tried to move. She only made it about 20 or 30 feet in the direction of the trail before collapsing. When rescuers reached her, she was lying on the ground facing the way out, only a short distance from where she had stayed with Drew. Drew died in the canyon sometime that afternoon. Elijah died a few hours later. Cassidy was found where Sean had left her beneath the small rock overhang. The empty water bottle was still propped against the rock, and Sean's phone was lying nearby. She was still alive when ground teams reached her, but she was unresponsive. She was airlifted out of the canyon, but died before she could reach a hospital. Cassidy Weston died from hyperthermia after her core body temperature rose beyond the point her body could recover. Severe dehydration and prolonged exposure to extreme heat without access to water were listed as contributing factors. Drew Tilden died before rescuers could reach him. The fall left him with a compound fracture of his left tibia and a traumatic brain injury caused by blunt force trauma to the left side of his skull. The coroner concluded that the combination of the head injury, blood loss from the open fracture, and prolonged heat exposure made survival unlikely even if help had arrived sooner given how remote the location was. His camera was recovered a few feet from where he fell. The footage ended mid-shot. Elijah Reeves died from hyperthermia and dehydration. Her phone was recovered beside her. The last photos on it were time-stamped at 11:47 that morning, less than an hour before Drew's fall. Sean Falco died on the trail less than a mile from the main route. The cause was hyperthermia and severe dehydration. He had covered more ground than the others, but had done so in direct sun with no water and nothing to slow the heat working through him. He was found by the hikers who had tried to help him, still sitting where they had left him. Investigators used GPS data from the drone controller, along with timestamps from the group's cameras and phones, to reconstruct their movements and determine how far into the unauthorized side canyon they had traveled. The deaths were ruled accidental. The official findings identified unauthorized entry into the restricted area, an inadequate water supply, and the resulting delay in rescue efforts as the primary factors that contributed to all deaths. The drone itself was never recovered.
I think this story shows that confidence and preparation are not the same thing. You can have plenty of one without nearly enough of the other.
It was July 10th, 2015. Surprise Canyon in Death Valley National Park was a narrow, rock-walled drainage where confined terrain and extreme heat quickly intensified conditions. Sunlight reflected off canyon walls, limiting shade to brief, shifting pockets. Jackson Dubois, 38, was a Colorado-based outdoor content creator running a gear testing channel focused on field performance under extreme conditions. His collaborator, Nadia Mbeki, 35, was a photographer assisting with documentation, with limited formal wilderness experience but strong general fitness. The expedition was structured as a sponsored product evaluation of heat-adaptive outdoor equipment, with deliverables tied to documented real-world performance and field footage expected for post-production review. Prior to the trip, Jackson tested a cooling vest, hydration system, solar charger, and lightweight footwear under controlled conditions with limited environmental stress, reinforcing confidence in their reliability. However, those tests did not replicate sustained exposure in a confined desert canyon where radiant heat from rock surfaces, ground temperatures exceeding 150 degrees Fahrenheit in exposed sections, and restricted airflow sharply increased physiological strain over time. My impression here is that the testing setup and the actual environment just feel like two completely different worlds. The pair entered Surprise Canyon early in the morning with a 2-day water supply intended for moderate exertion and planned filming stops. Initial progress was steady with intermittent shade, but rising sun quickly intensified heat as canyon walls began reflecting radiation into the narrow corridor, creating sustained exposure even in partially shaded sections. By mid-morning, the cooling vests start to lose effectiveness. The phase change material inside them is basically spent, so at that point it's just a slight surface cooling effect, nothing that actually helps with the core body heat anymore. They're sweating heavily too, both of them, and that's speeding up dehydration fast. On top of that, the terrain keeps forcing constant effort, uneven ground, short climbs, all within the canyon floor, so there's really no chance to settle or recover. A solar charger they set up around midday also doesn't hold up well. The extreme heat causes it to overheat and shut down intermittently, so instead of steady power, it only gives short, unreliable bursts of charging. By early afternoon, they reach a planned rest point. Water is already running low, and early signs of dehydration are showing headache, fatigue, slower thinking. But at the time, it still just feels like normal exertion, not something that calls for turning back. It reads to me like things are starting to feel routine even while they aren't. They decide to push on to an upper canyon section for more documentation anyway, staying out through the peak heat window when the sun's radiation is at its strongest. On the way back, things start to fall apart faster. The heat stress and dehydration don't level off, they stack. Then one more issue hits. Jackson's footwear starts breaking down. The adhesive softens in the heat and the sole begins to separate, which makes movement unstable. Every step takes more effort, slower, and more careful, right when fluid levels are already critically low. Shortly afterward, both individuals exhausted their remaining water supplies. Nadia developed acute gastrointestinal distress alongside worsening heat illness, forcing repeated stops in minimal available shade. Cognitive function declined in both individuals, with impaired decision-making, reduced situational awareness, and slowed response to environmental cues. Communication systems initially failed due to lack of signal within the canyon and device limitations under thermal stress. As conditions deteriorated, Nadia managed to reach a higher ridgeline and briefly establish emergency contact, transmitting location data and initiating a rescue response before her condition worsened further. Me seeing her having to climb just to get signal really highlights how a location alone can control whether help is even possible. While awaiting rescue, Jackson's condition rapidly progressed from heat exhaustion to severe heat stroke. He became disoriented, unable to maintain coherent speech, and lost the ability to regulate body temperature. Core physiological collapse followed sustained hyperthermia and dehydration. Rescue teams arrived after several hours via coordinated ground and aerial deployment. Nadia was located first in critical condition and evacuated, while Jackson was found shortly after in a lower drainage segment, unresponsive, with signs consistent with advanced heat stroke. Despite rapid cooling efforts and emergency transport, both individuals' conditions had progressed beyond recovery. Jackson was pronounced dead shortly after evacuation due to hyperthermia and multi-organ failure from prolonged exposure, exertion, and dehydration. Nadia also succumbed to severe heat stroke and organ failure during emergency treatment at a medical facility. In the aftermath, investigators identified multiple contributing factors, including reliance on controlled condition equipment testing, underestimation of radiant heat amplification within confined canyon geometry, continued exertion during early physiological decline, and delayed emergency activation due to communication constraints. The incident was later cited in outdoor safety analyses as a case demonstrating how gear performance claims and controlled testing environments cannot substitute for real-world thermal load assessment in extreme desert terrain. It was July 14th, 2022. Across the Furnace Creek Basin in Death Valley National Park, conditions were already shaping up to be one of the park's most dangerous midsummer heat events. Later that day, Augustus Hargrove and Cypress Pelletier planned to film near Devil's Golf Course, where exposed salt flats and dark mineral surfaces would absorb hours of direct sunlight before they ever stepped onto them. Now, one of the men was Augustus Hargrove. He was 29 years old and worked as an independent personal trainer and fitness content creator based in Phoenix, Arizona. His online content centered on extreme conditioning, featuring desert runs, loaded hikes, sauna sessions, and other endurance challenges. The message behind it was simple: deliberately embracing physical discomfort could build superior resilience. He stood 5 feet 11 with a heavily muscular build. He'd completed several desert endurance events, trained regularly through Arizona summers, and had never experienced a significant heat-related illness. So, to him, those experiences reinforced the same belief over and over again that disciplined preparation allowed him to perform safely in environments most people considered hazardous.
Every time he walked away from something like that without getting hurt, it just stacked another layer onto the same conclusion.
Then there was Cypress Pelletier. He was 31 years old and worked as an online fitness coach and supplement ambassador based in Scottsdale, Arizona. His content focused on performance, recovery, and heat adaptation, and he often pointed to research on sauna training as evidence that repeated heat exposure improved tolerance in extreme environments. Pelletier stood 6 feet 1 with substantial lean muscle mass, and like Hargrove, he had no history of heat stroke or any other serious exertional illness. Frequent sauna sessions were a central part of his training routine, and after years of doing them, they gave him real confidence that the conditioning he'd built would translate directly to the desert.
He wasn't guessing, he genuinely believed the science backed him up, and that's actually what makes this harder to sit with.
The two men had spent several weeks planning a collaborative video centered on a simple premise: completing a strenuous midday hike in Death Valley National Park at the hottest point of the day. They chose the location and timing deliberately, believing the extreme conditions would create dramatic visuals, while reinforcing their message that elite conditioning allowed them to perform where others could not. Their preparation focused largely on fitness rather than the specific environmental hazards of Death Valley. Both drew confidence from years of legitimate desert training in Arizona, assuming the park presented a more intense version of conditions they already understood. What they failed to recognize was that the Furnace Creek Basin in mid-July creates a combination of radiant heat, ground temperatures, and prolonged exposure that differs fundamentally from the environments in which they had built that confidence. The comparison was understandable but incomplete. Much of their desert training had taken place around Phoenix, where routes typically remained close to roads, neighborhoods, or trailheads, allowing them to end a workout, return to an air-conditioned vehicle, or seek shelter if conditions became more severe than expected. Even during periods of extreme heat, the environment generally provided frequent opportunities to reduce exposure before it progressed into a medical emergency.
That safety net was so built into everything they'd ever done out there that I don't think either of them even noticed it was there.
The terrain they planned to cross in Death Valley offered far fewer of those safeguards. Once they left the parking area, they entered an open basin with virtually no natural shade, no reliable source of cooling, and limited options for rapidly ending the hike without retracing their steps across the same exposed ground. Every additional minute spent walking increased the total amount of heat absorbed by the body. Unlike a structured training session, where intensity could be reduced or the workout stopped at any time, the return journey required continued movement through the same conditions that had already begun overwhelming their ability to regulate core temperature. That difference actually started with the ground itself. See, a lot of the exposed terrain around the Furnace Creek Basin sits below sea level. It's made up of packed salt clay, dark mineral deposits, and exposed rock that soak up huge amounts of sunlight all morning long. And by the middle of the day in July, those surfaces don't just get hot, they become much hotter than the surrounding air. The forecast the two men had looked at was based on the shaded air temperature, not the much higher heat radiating off the ground they were planning to walk across.
I keep coming back to that. They checked the forecast, they did that part, and it still gave them a completely wrong picture of what they were walking into.
And that's a really important difference. Walking across terrain like that meant their bodies were taking in heat from below, through the ground, from above, through direct sunlight, and from the surrounding air all at the same time. It created a combined thermal load that was far greater than the air temperature alone would suggest. Both men genuinely understood hot weather training, but they had never actually experienced that combination of heat in the Furnace Creek Basin. That's the part they didn't realize was different. Relative humidity that day was extremely low, so sweat evaporated almost immediately. Normally that would help cool the body, but here it also meant they stayed relatively dry on the surface while still losing fluids faster than they realized. Coming from Arizona's dry heat, neither man read that as a warning sign.
Dry skin in dry heat? To them, that probably just felt like Tuesday.
A light breeze did little to help. Once the air itself became extremely hot, moving air stopped providing meaningful cooling and instead just added to the overall heat load they were carrying. Their gear added to the strain. Both wore compression clothing meant for performance and support, but in that kind of heat, it trapped warmth against the skin and reduced heat loss. They each carried a 3-liter hydration pack with electrolytes, which they were used to relying on in desert training. But under the pace they were filming at, in those conditions, they were likely losing fluids faster than they could replace them, and the water supply wasn't going to last as long as they expected. The last factor was probably the one both men trusted the most. In fact, they saw it as their biggest advantage. Both of them had spent years building lean muscle, and it had become a huge part of who they were. It was central to their careers, their training, and the image they shared online. And in almost every athletic setting, that kind of muscle was a real advantage. It meant more strength, better endurance, and a greater ability to handle hard physical work. But in extreme heat, that same muscle came with a downside. The more muscle you have, the more metabolic heat your body produces during exertion. And once you combine that with intense sunlight, superheated ground, and extremely hot air, the body can only get rid of heat so fast. Their core temperatures began rising much faster than either man expected. It's a relationship that's well documented in heat physiology, but it wasn't something either of them had ever really factored into the way they understood heat training.
The thing they'd spent years building, the thing their whole identity was wrapped around, was working directly against them out there.
Pelletier's confidence was also reinforced by years of regular sauna training, which he saw as preparation for extreme desert heat. But there was one really important difference. In a sauna, you're mostly sitting still in a controlled environment. Out here, they were hiking across Death Valley under direct sunlight while walking on ground that was radiating enormous amounts of heat back into their bodies. Regular sauna sessions can absolutely improve the body's response to heat, but those adaptations have limits. They can't fully compensate when the heat coming from the environment, combined with the heat your own body is producing, exceeds your body's ability to cool itself. Those were the environmental, physiological, and logistical conditions as the two men arrived at Furnace Creek on the morning of July 14, 2022. The Furnace Creek Visitor Center parking lot sits at the edge of the basin, with pavement, low buildings, and open desert beyond. The air was already unusually hot, but familiar enough for both men after years of training in Arizona, so it didn't feel out of the ordinary. They began filming almost immediately. Early footage later reviewed by investigators shows them setting up shots, discussing the plan, and adjusting gear while moving around the parking area. They appeared comfortable, and the heat mainly reinforced their belief that the conditions were manageable.
Watching footage of people who have no idea what's coming is one of the stranger parts of working through cases like this.
After spending more than an hour filming around the visitor area, the two men eventually walked into the visitor center to ask about getting to the location where they planned to shoot their video. As the ranger on duty listened to their plan, one thing immediately caught his attention: they wanted to begin crossing the exposed flats around noon. The ranger immediately advised against it and made clear that park staff could not recommend or support the route under those conditions. According to the later investigation, he explained just how dangerous the Furnace Creek Basin becomes in the middle of the day, then stepped outside with a handheld infrared thermometer and pointed it at the exposed pavement. Even though it was still morning, the reading showed the ground was already much hotter than the surrounding air. And it was only going to keep getting hotter as the sun climbed higher.
He didn't just tell them, he put a number in front of their faces right there on the thermometer, and they still didn't move.
The ranger also started asking a few more questions. He wanted to know how much water they were carrying, whether they had a satellite communicator or any other way to call for help, how far they planned to travel from the access road, and if either of them had actually hiked in Death Valley during the middle of summer before. Their answers made it clear they had plenty of experience training in Arizona deserts, but very little experience with the specific conditions inside the Furnace Creek Basin. The ranger explained that desert fitness and experience were valuable, but they didn't automatically prepare someone for Death Valley during the hottest part of the year. He also recommended beginning any strenuous activity shortly after sunrise or postponing the hike until late afternoon, when the thermal load on the body would be substantially lower. The two men declined to alter their production schedule, explaining that the video depended on filming under the harshest midday light. The ranger made it clear that he would not help plan, endorse, or support the route under those conditions. In his judgment, the environmental risk was simply too high. His warning was not based on their physical fitness, but on the conditions they intended to enter. A man whose entire job involved working in that environment looked at those conditions and decided they were not worth the risk. A man whose entire job is working in that environment looked at those conditions and said he wouldn't go out there himself. And somehow that still didn't land. Both men acknowledged the demonstration, and they even recorded part of the conversation on camera. But instead of taking it as a reason to rethink their plan, they seemed to see it as proof that the challenge was exactly what they had hoped it would be. In a way, the Ranger's warning reinforced the story they wanted to tell. Before leaving the visitor center, the Ranger documented that they had been warned about the heat, advised not to begin during the midday period, and declined a written heat safety handout. After leaving the visitor center, the two men drove south toward Devil's Golf Course. The location was exactly what they wanted for the video: a vast expanse of exposed salt formations, mineral-stained ground, and visible heat shimmer stretching across the basin. They parked near the access road and spent the remainder of the morning preparing equipment and filming sponsor content while waiting for the hottest part of the day. Instead of getting an early start, Hargrove and Pelletier spent the rest of the morning near their vehicle. Later, when investigators reviewed the footage from their cameras, it became clear that this wasn't a delay or a last-minute decision. It was part of the plan from the beginning. They wanted to start filming under the harshest midday sunlight because they believed it would create the most dramatic visuals for their audience. During the wait, they filmed sponsor content, reviewed gear, and stayed inside the air-conditioned SUV between takes. They drank electrolyte beverages but ate very little, entering the hike feeling rested and confident that they had prepared appropriately. Shortly before midday, they left the vehicle and began crossing the exposed salt clay flats they had chosen for the challenge. There was no established trail. The goal was simply to travel across the open terrain while filming under the harshest possible midday conditions. They walked out of an air-conditioned car into 120-degree heat and started filming. That transition alone is staggering to me. By the time they left the parking area, exposed ground surfaces had already reached temperatures far exceeding the surrounding air. The salt clay flats and dark rock had absorbed hours of direct sunlight, producing the visible heat shimmer the two men had intentionally chosen as the backdrop for their video. They filmed continuously as they walked, with Hargrove using a handheld gimbal and Pelletier wearing a chest-mounted camera, maintaining a steady pace across the open terrain. For the first several minutes, everything appeared to be going exactly as they had planned. Both men walked at a comfortable pace, taking turns filming one another while occasionally stopping to reposition the cameras for wider shots across the basin. They spoke comfortably, reviewed a few clips on their screens, and continued moving without any obvious signs of difficulty. As they moved farther away from the parking area, the stops became a little more frequent. Sometimes it was to frame another shot, other times to wipe dust from a camera lens or check that the equipment was still recording properly. Neither stop lasted very long, and both men treated them as part of the filming process rather than a response to the heat. After another several minutes, both began reaching for their hydration packs more often than they had during the opening part of the hike. They took longer drinks between filming segments, and recovered footage later showed Hargrove briefly commenting on how surprisingly warm the water had already become after sitting in the sun. Even so, neither suggested turning back, and they continued following the route they had planned. The heat from the ground also became harder to ignore. At one point, Hargrove briefly lifted one foot after stopping to adjust the gimbal, while Pelletier looked down at the surface before continuing forward. Neither appeared alarmed, but investigators later noted that both men were spending more time standing still whenever they paused, as if unconsciously trying to recover before walking again. Their filming also became less fluid than it had been near the visitor center. Small interruptions that normally would have taken only a few seconds checking battery levels, cleaning lenses, adjusting camera mounts, or reviewing footage began happening more often. None of those actions seemed unusual by themselves, but together they suggested that the physical effort of simply remaining in the environment was beginning to compete with the attention they had originally devoted to producing the video. Both wore lightweight running shoes with breathable mesh uppers, a practical choice for many desert trails, but less suited to the extreme radiant heat beneath their feet. While the shoes protected them from direct contact with the ground, they offered limited insulation from the intense heat rising from the surface with every step. Approximately 25 minutes into the terrain segment, a family visiting from Oregon later reported seeing two men filming in the open basin. They described both as muscular and athletic, but recalled that one of them stopped repeatedly to rest despite despite appearing exceptionally fit. At the time, nothing about the scene seemed unusual enough to warrant intervention.
They looked so capable from the outside that nobody thought to worry. That's a detail I can't stop thinking about.
After they left the access road, no ranger witnessed every moment of the challenge. The final sequence was reconstructed from recovered camera footage, visitor photographs, emergency call records, ranger documentation, medical findings, and witness statements from people who saw the two men on the flats that afternoon. Footage recovered from Hargrove's camera shows the first subtle signs of physical decline. His walking became slightly uneven, with a few brief balance corrections on otherwise flat ground. Neither man commented on it, and filming continued. As investigators reviewed the recordings, they noted a gradual shift in pace and rhythm. Conversations became shorter, with longer pauses, and their breathing grew more audible, even between comments. The camera was also adjusted more often as Hargrove lowered it between shots. Overall, the filming became less steady and more fragmented. They paused more frequently to adjust gear or hydration packs, and several clips ended or drifted off framing before being corrected. Investigators later viewed these changes as early signs that heat stress was beginning to affect focus, coordination, and consistency. By the time they'd walked only about 0.6 of a mile, it had gotten incredibly hot. The air was already well over 120 degrees, and the ground under their feet was even hotter than that. Their hydration packs had also been baking in the sun for close to an hour, so the water inside was warm by then. They could still drink it, and they did, but it just didn't help cool them down the way cold or even cool water normally would.
0.6 of a mile. That's less than 7 minutes of walking at a normal pace, and they were already in serious trouble.
Footage from Pelletier's chest-mounted camera captured another early warning sign as he reached to adjust a lens cap. His hands displayed a fine, persistent tremor that was noticeable in close-up footage, though he showed no reaction and continued filming. Around the same time, Hargrove was seen pouring water over his forearms in an effort to cool himself. It was a legitimate field technique, but under the combined effects of extreme air temperature, radiant ground heat, and sustained exertion, it offered only limited relief. As they continued across the basin, Pelletier gradually drifted away from their intended route. Hargrove redirected him, and he corrected course without hesitation or any apparent awareness that he had begun wandering. Investigators later noted that this type of subtle directional drift is consistent with the early neurological effects of rising core body temperature, when heat-related cognitive impairment begins before the affected person recognizes that anything is wrong.
He didn't know he was drifting. That's the part that gets me. He was already being affected and had no idea.
As they kept moving across the open basin, Hargrove suddenly stumbled on completely flat ground. There wasn't a rock or any obvious obstacle in front of him. He caught himself on one knee, paused for a moment, then got back up. A family watching from a nearby roadside pull-off noticed it. While they were taking pictures of the landscape, they happened to capture a photo that would later help investigators piece together the timeline leading up to the emergency. After that stumble, something else changed. Hargrove's handheld camera was either set down or slipped from his hand, and it just kept recording from ground level. The footage showed the lower legs of both men, the heat shimmering off the ground, and the sky stretching out above them. Nobody said they were done filming, and there was no sign that the camera had been placed there on purpose. It simply stayed where it landed as everything that followed unfolded.
There's just something about footage that just keeps running after the person holding it can't anymore that I find genuinely hard to watch.
The first collapse occurred shortly after noon. Hargrove did not fall forward. He sat down abruptly near a low basalt outcrop about 2/3 of a mile from the access road, with no visible attempt to ease himself into a resting position. The dark mineral surface beneath him had been absorbing direct sunlight for hours and was radiating intense heat. Instead of cooling him, sitting on the ground added to his already overwhelming thermal load. He never stood again. When Pelletier saw Hargrove go down, he started moving toward a shallow rock shadow about 40 feet away. It was probably the closest bit of shade he could see, but he never made it. About halfway there, he began losing coordination. First, he dropped to his hands and knees, and then he rolled onto his side. Investigators later concluded that the way he came to rest was consistent with someone who had tried to catch themselves during a fall, but no longer had enough muscular control to do it. At that point, both men were on the ground in the middle of the exposed basin. The air temperature was already above 120 degrees, and the ground beneath them was even hotter. Their phones were still in their gear and within reach, but severe hyperthermia can quickly affect both fine motor control and clear thinking. Even something as simple as pulling out a phone, unlocking it, and making a call can become incredibly difficult. Investigators later concluded that both men had likely reached core temperatures where they were no longer able to carry out those steps reliably, even if they knew they were in serious danger. The Oregon family, watching from a nearby roadside pull-off, called emergency services after observing observing the two men, remain motionless for several minutes. Additional visitors on the access road reported the emergency shortly afterward, prompting the park's emergency response. Emergency response in the Furnace Creek Basin during periods of extreme heat operates under strict safety protocols. Rangers and EMS personnel limit their time on exposed terrain, work in pairs, and rotate through air-conditioned vehicles because the same conditions that endanger visitors also threaten rescuers.
The people going in to help them needed a rotation schedule just to survive the same ground those two men walked out onto voluntarily.
First responders reached the two men about 27 minutes after the initial emergency services call. Both were unresponsive and showed signs consistent with severe hyperthermia. They were transported to the nearest road access point before being airlifted to a regional trauma center, but neither regained consciousness. Augustus Hargrove was pronounced dead later that afternoon. Cypress Pelletier died a short time afterward. The local coroner's office determined that both men died from hyperthermia with multi-organ failure. Their core body temperatures had risen to levels that caused irreversible damage to the brain, cardiovascular system, and other vital organs before definitive medical treatment could be provided. Both examinations also found evidence of rhabdomyolysis, a condition in which severely stressed muscle tissue breaks down and releases proteins into the bloodstream, placing additional strain on the kidneys. Investigators found no underlying medical conditions that contributed to either death, concluding that both fatalities resulted from extreme environmental heat combined with physical exertion.
The muscle tissue itself was breaking down. Their own bodies became part of what killed them.
The investigative review classified the incident as preventable. Its internal review identified three primary contributing factors: disregarding ranger safety guidance, deliberately choosing to begin the hike during the day's most dangerous heat for filming purposes, and overestimating the protection offered by previous heat training in environments that differed fundamentally from Death Valley's extreme radiant heat. The rangers' contemporaneous log documenting that they had been warned about the heat, advised not to begin at midday, and declined a written heat safety handout was included in the review as part of the incident record. It was April 14th, 2023. A remote section of Death Valley National Park formed a network of canyons, dry washes, and broken ridgelines where navigation errors could quickly lead to isolation. The terrain included narrow limestone cuts, unstable talus slopes, and dry drainages with seasonal or unreliable water sources. Jonah Okoye, 34, was a Texas-based content creator running a channel testing new tech in real-world settings. He was especially focused on AI tools, basically seeing if they could actually handle planning trips, not just generate them on paper. For this project, he used an AI travel assistant to build a full wilderness route with almost no input from him.
I keep noticing how easy it's become to treat AI output like it's already been checked for facts, even when it hasn't.
A few days before the trip, he accepts an AI-generated Death Valley route with canyons, a mapped water source, and a ridge connection, treating it as a controlled test without really adjusting or questioning it. The plan looked structured but had major issues that weren't caught before departure. A seasonally dry water source, altered routes from erosion and flash flooding, underestimated hydration needs, and a ridge section requiring technical talus movement. None of it was independently verified. A park ranger briefly warned him that water in the area was uncertain, but he proceeded anyway. He entered the backcountry with limited water, standard gear, and no emergency communication device. Once past the trailhead, cell service dropped as he moved deeper into the canyon system under rising temperatures.
I've seen that moment before where the connection just disappears and you're fully on your own after that point.
Early progress through the drainage network was steady, though an unexpected washout forced an unplanned detour across unstable debris fields. The added distance and physical effort increased exertion beyond initial projections. By late morning, as ambient temperatures climbed and solar exposure intensified, his rate of hydration consumption increased significantly. As the terrain opened into exposed sections of sand and fractured rock, heat reflected upward from pale surfaces, compounding thermal strain. Fatigue began to accumulate, and rest intervals became more frequent. Despite these signs, Jonah continued along the planned route, relying on the assumption that the next waypoint would provide relief and replenishment. At the mapped water source, Jonah found only a dry basin, as the AI had incorrectly assumed seasonal flow. With no nearby alternatives and reduced reserves, he documented the failure on camera but continued the route, prioritizing completion of the experiment over retreat. Overnight conditions allowed limited recovery, but the next segment proved more severe than expected. The ridge connection required sustained climbing over unstable talus and fractured rock, increasing exertion and fluid loss at a critical stage. During the ascent, he slipped and struck his knee on exposed stone, significantly reducing mobility. From that point, both ascent and descent became hazardous due to injury, fatigue, and unstable terrain. His remaining water soon ran out, and he became increasingly disoriented with no reliable communication. He recorded a short video describing his condition before attempting a descent, but progress was slow and limited by injury and exhaustion. Concern was raised when he failed to return on schedule and his vehicle remained at the trailhead, prompting a search operation across the canyon network with ground teams and aerial reconnaissance deployed. That short recording ends up being the only thing I have to go on once everything else goes quiet. He was eventually located in a lower drainage zone, conscious but severely dehydrated, with a swollen knee and limited mobility. His condition was critical, with signs of advanced heat illness compounded by prolonged exposure and fluid loss. Although ground teams reached him and began assisted movement out of the canyon, his condition deteriorated rapidly during extraction. The combination of severe dehydration, exertional heat stress, and inability to stabilize his body temperature led to collapse before evacuation could be completed. He was pronounced dead shortly after being transferred to a ranger-accessible point, with medical assessments citing hyperthermia and multi-organ failure consistent with prolonged heat exposure and exertion under dehydration. The incident was later classified as a high-risk backcountry fatality, driven by reliance on unverified algorithmic route planning, compounded by inaccurate environmental assumptions, insufficient emergency preparedness, and delayed effective response once incapacitation occurred. Officials emphasized that digital navigation tools cannot replace field verification in remote desert environments where conditions can shift rapidly. It was July 10th, 2021. And the thermometer outside the visitor center at Furnace Creek had already cleared 117 degrees before lunch. Death Valley was in the middle of the kind of heat wave that makes the national news. The week the official gauge would touch 130, one of the highest temperatures ever reliably recorded anywhere on the planet. To put that in perspective, a normal oven set to keep food warm sits not far above that. The parking lot at the Golden Canyon trailhead shimmered like there was water on it. Most people who pulled in took one step out of their air conditioning, felt the air hit them like an open oven door, and got right back in their cars to go find a viewpoint they could enjoy through a windshield. The radio that morning was full of heat warnings, the kind that tell people to stay indoors, check on elderly neighbors, and never leave anyone sitting in a parked car. And the whole region was bracing for a day that would break records. One of them did not. Her name was Leanna Marchetti, 28 years old, and to thousands of people online, she was a full-time adventure influencer. Her whole brand was being the fearless one, the girl who did the thing everyone else was too scared or too sensible to do, and she had the numbers to prove that people loved watching it. She had built that following over years, one bigger risk at a time, swimming in places with signs that said "do not swim," climbing things that were roped off, walking up to wild animals other people backed away from. The trouble with a brand like that is that it has to keep escalating. An audience that follows you because you are fearless gets bored the moment you start looking careful, and Leanna knew it. Every video had to be a little bolder than the last one, a little closer to a line, and the comments rewarded her every time she leaned further out over the edge. She had come to Death Valley in the worst week of the entire summer on purpose, because heat that made the news made for views, and a video of her conquering the hottest place on Earth in record temperatures was exactly the kind of thing her audience showed up for. She had the whole video planned in her head before she ever left the car. The dramatic walk into the canyon, the harsh light, a piece to camera at the top about pushing past your limits, and a caption about doing the thing everyone swore was impossible. It was going to be one of her best, the kind of post that pulls in a wave of new followers and a flood of comments calling her a legend. In a strange way, the Ranger had handed her a gift, because now the video had a villain to wave off at the start, a perfect little setup for the triumph she was certain was waiting at the end. Here's the thing you have to understand about how she saw a place like this. To Leanna, a warning was not a warning, it was a setup for a better video. The scarier something sounded, the better the story when she walked away from it, smiling, unbothered, proven right. She had spent years training her audience to expect exactly that, and she had spent those same years quietly training herself to ignore the part of her brain that was supposed to be afraid. By the time she got to Death Valley, that part of her had been overruled so many times that it had basically stopped speaking up. I've seen her type before, the kind who built a brand on ignoring advice, so to her, a ranger saying no was just more content. Death Valley is not dangerous the way a cliff is dangerous, where you can see the edge and respect it. It kills you quietly, through a number on a thermometer that does not look like it should be able to hurt you. There is no claw, no fall, no single dramatic moment, just heat, steady and patient and absolutely without mercy. That is exactly what makes it so deadly, because a threat you cannot see and cannot feel sneaking up on you is a threat that is very easy to underestimate right up until the point where it is far too late to do anything about it. In heat like that, your body is in a fight from the second you step outside. You sweat out water faster than you could ever drink it back, and because the desert air is so dry, the sweat evaporates off your skin almost the instant it appears, so you often cannot even see that you are drenched and emptying out. The official temperature is always measured in the shade. Out in the open, on dark rock, in direct sun, the real temperature against your body runs far higher than whatever number the sign in the parking lot shows. People walk out into that believing the sign, never understanding that the sign was describing the easiest version of where they were going. By the time most people understand that difference, they are already deep into the canyon, already low on water, and already feeling a little off in a way they cannot quite put a name to. Death Valley kills people every single year, and the ones it kills are almost always the ones who came to look at it rather than to survive it. Tourists step out for a quick photo and go down within sight of the road. Hikers underestimate a short trail and never climb back out of it. The rangers will tell you the same thing over and over, that the desert does not care how fit you are or how many hard things you have done somewhere cooler. Fitness buys you a little extra time out here and absolutely nothing more. What actually keeps you alive is respect, water, and the sense to be shaded and still when the sun is at its worst. I tell people Death Valley in July is not a desert, it's a furnace with a parking lot. The hike she had picked was the Golden Canyon Loop, a route that climbs up through a maze of golden and red rock toward the famous overlook at Zabriskie Point and comes back down through a wash called Gower Gulch. In the cool months, it is one of the most beautiful and popular day hikes in the entire park, busy with families and photographers. In July, it is a different thing wearing the same name. There is no water anywhere on it, none, and there is no shade either, not a single tree, not one reliable overhang, just bare rock that drinks the sun all day and throws it back at you from every direction at once. The Badlands have one more trick to them, and it is the one that turns a heat emergency into a death. They look identical in every direction. The same bleached gold walls, the same dry folds and ridges, narrow side canyons branching off the main route like hallways in a building with no signs and no numbers on the doors. With a clear head and a marked trail, it is a wonderful place to wander. With a cooking brain and no landmarks, it is a trap that closes so softly you do not even hear it shut behind you. Search teams have pulled people out of those exact side canyons before, some of them only a short distance off the main trail, close enough that on a clear-headed day they could have walked back out in minutes. I've walked those Badlands, and there's no shade out there. Not a tree, not an overhang, just rock throwing heat back at you. The man standing near the trailhead that morning was a ranger named Cal Renfro. Cal had worked Death Valley for the better part of 30 years, and in that time he had helped carry more than a few people out of these canyons, some of them walking and shaking and lucky, and some of them not walking at all. Summer was the season he hated, because summer was when people came from all over the world to see the famous heat, treating a killer like a tourist attraction, and a certain number of them every single year decided that the warnings were meant for somebody else. He had learned over the decades to read people fast, because reading them fast was sometimes the only thing that saved them. He knew the difference between the hiker who was nervous and prepared and the hiker who was confident and carrying nothing. He knew that the dangerous ones were almost never the ones who looked scared. They were the ones who looked sure of themselves. The ones who had clearly done risky things before and gotten away with it, because getting away with it was exactly what taught them they could not be hurt. Cal spotted Liana the moment she stepped out of her car with a phone already pointed at her own face. Cal spent 30 years pulling people off that trail. When a man like that tells me to turn around, I'm back in my car before he even finishes the sentence. He did what he always did. He walked over, friendly but serious, and told her plainly that she should not attempt the loop today. He told her it was already over 115 degrees and still climbing, that the canyon would be hotter still with no air moving through it, and that people had died on easier hikes than this one, in less heat than this. He pointed at the small bottle clipped to her bag and told her that was not nearly enough water, that a hike like this in this heat needed gallons, not a bottle. He told her that if she truly meant to do it, she had to start at first light the next morning, not late on a day that was already an emergency. None of what Cal said was an opinion, and none of it was him being dramatic. It was the same message printed on the big signs all around the parking lot, the ones with the red letters that exist precisely because so many people have died doing exactly what she was about to do. The park does not send rangers out to warn people at that trailhead in a heat wave for fun. It puts them there because that specific trail, in that specific heat, has a body count, and because a friendly human voice saying "turn around" saves more lives than any sign ever has. Cal had personally turned a lot of people back over the years. Most of them, when it came down to it, listened. Liana did not listen. She turned the camera on him instead. For her followers, she narrated the whole thing as it happened. This overprotective ranger who thought a little walk was going to kill her, who so clearly did not know who he was talking to. She let him finish, thanked him with the kind of smile that was really a dismissal, and told him she would be totally fine. She did stuff like this all the time. Then she clipped her one small bottle back onto her bag, fixed her hair in the camera, and started up the trail into the canyon while he stood there and watched her go. There was nothing he could legally do to stop a grown woman from taking a walk in a national park. She was not the only person Cal spoke to that morning, and she was not the only one who had shown up wanting to hike. The difference was that the others listened. A couple turned around right there in the lot and decided to come back at dawn instead. A young guy who had planned the very same loop took one more look at the heat shimmering off the rock, thanked the ranger, and went to find an air-conditioned diner. None of them got a video out of it, and all of them are still alive. That is the quiet, unglamorous truth about this place, that the people who leave with nothing to post are usually the ones who leave at all. I've watched that clip more than once. She rolls her eyes at Cal while he tells her people die out here. I have thought a lot about what was going through her head as she walked away from that man. I do not think she was being brave, and I do not even think she was being stupid in the way we usually mean it. I think she had simply done this exact thing so many times, ignored so many warnings, and walked away fine that the warnings had stopped carrying any weight at all. Cal was not a 30-year expert to her. He was just one more worried voice to wave off on the way to the shot she wanted. No different from a comment telling her to be careful that she would scroll right past. She started up Golden Canyon a little before 11 in the morning, which is just about the worst possible hour to begin. The early part of the trail was everything she had come for. The walls rose up around her in deep gold and rust red. The light was harsh and dramatic in a way that looks incredible on camera, and the footage she shot in that first half hour was really beautiful. She was moving easily, the trail rising only gently as it wound up into the canyon, narrating as she went, smiling, vindicated. There was no reason in those first minutes for her to feel anything but good about her choice, and that, more than anything, is how the desert gets you. Heading into those canyons at noon never feels dangerous in the moment, and that's the trick of it. I've watched the desert let people walk in. The trail drew her deeper in. She climbed up the side spur toward Red Cathedral, a towering wall of rust-colored rock that is one of the most photographed spots on the whole route, and then pushed on up toward Manly Beacon and the high point of the loop. Down in the lower canyon, the rock walls pressed in close on both sides and trapped the heat like an oven with the door shut. No breeze at all, not a breath of moving air to carry any of it away. Higher up, where the trail climbed out of the canyon and into the open Badlands toward Manly Beacon, the walls fell away and took even the idea of shade with them, leaving her out under a sun that did not let up for a second. She was sweating hard now, though in that dryness she still could not see it, and she was reaching for her one bottle far more often than she had planned to. What made the first part feel so easy was also exactly what made it so dangerous, and she had no way to feel that yet. The trail climbs the whole way in, gaining hundreds of feet up through the wash and out into the open Badlands toward the high ground around Manly Beacon, and the hardest, most exposed stretch of the loop was still ahead of her. Every comfortable step in the cool of the morning carried her deeper into the maze and farther from the only safety there was, her car back at the trailhead. She felt strong and capable and completely right. The desert was simply waiting for the heat of the afternoon to hand her the bill. The first part of that trail feels easy, a gentle walk up a pretty canyon. I promise you that's just the desert letting you get far from your car. By the time she reached the upper section, somewhere in the early afternoon, the temperature down in that open canyon was well past anything the visitor center sign had shown that morning. This is the part of these stories that people who have never stood in it cannot quite picture. It was not uncomfortable the way a hot day at home is uncomfortable. It was a physical force, a steady pressure leaning on her from every direction, the air itself too hot to take any heat away from her no matter how hard or fast she breathed. Her pace fell off. The filming, the entire reason she had driven out here, slowed and then mostly stopped because the heat had begun to demand everything she had just to keep putting one foot in front of the other. By the middle of the afternoon, the canyon had become something close to a kiln. The walls threw heat at her face and her back at the same time, the ground cooked up through the soles of her shoes, and the air gave her nothing to work with no matter how deeply she breathed. She had stopped filming a while ago. The bright, chatty narration of the morning was gone, replaced by the simple animal work of moving forward through air that felt like it was trying to hold her in place. She was deep into the loop now, too far along for turning back to feel obvious, and nowhere near close enough to the end for finishing to be safe. There is a cruel arithmetic to a loop trail in heat like that, where the safest choice and the fastest choice stop being the same thing, and a tired brain almost always grabs for fast. Somewhere on that upper stretch, her water ran out. The small bottle that Cal had pointed at and warned her about, the one she had clipped back on with a smile, was empty hours before she could possibly be back at her car, and there was not one more drop anywhere on that trail. From that moment, she was on a clock that could not be stopped or reset. She was losing water with every breath and every step, in temperatures that would not begin to drop until long after dark, with the hardest climbing of the loop and the long descent through Gower Gulch still standing between her and the parking lot. She carried one little designer water bottle on a hike that needed a gallon. In that heat, that bottle is not water, it's a timer. The first real trouble was almost certainly a headache and a creeping dizziness, the kind of thing that is easy to argue yourself out of for a little while when you are determined to finish. But in heat like that, the body does not give you long to negotiate. As she kept moving, her core temperature was climbing past the point a human being can survive, and the warning signs were stacking up one on top of another. The pounding head, the wave of nausea, the strange and sudden heaviness in her legs that no amount of willpower could lift. At some point, and this is one of the most dangerous moments of all, her skin would have stopped feeling sweaty and started feeling hot and dry. That is the signal that the body's entire cooling system has failed, that it has run out of water to sweat with and simply given up trying. From there, the internal temperature rises fast, and the organ that suffers first and worst is the brain. The very tool she needed most to save herself, clear and careful thinking, was the first thing the heat reached in and switched off. Heat stroke doesn't feel like just being hot. Your judgment is the first thing to go, so the moment you need to think clearly, your own brain stops helping you. And this is where the desert does its cruelest work, because once the thinking goes, everything else follows. A clear-headed person in trouble turns around and retraces their steps straight back to the trailhead they know. Liana, by every later reconstruction of what happened, did the opposite of that. Somewhere up in the maze of the upper Badlands, she left the main trail entirely, turning off into a narrow side canyon. Whether she was chasing one last shot, or convinced it was a shortcut, or simply no longer able to tell the difference. The marked loop was hard enough in that heat. Off the trail, in that terrain, she had just walked into the one place nobody searching would think to look first. Investigators believe she did try to keep going for a long while, the way determined people do, pushing through signals that should have stopped her cold. But heat does not respect determination. The very grit that had built her whole career, the refusal to quit, the certainty that she could power through anything, was now working directly against her, driving her forward and burning through her last reserves when the one thing that might have saved her was to stop, find whatever sliver of shelter existed, and wait for the cool of night. Her greatest strength had quietly turned into the thing walking her toward the edge. Those canyons all look the same inside, like a maze cut from an oven. You don't feel lost in there until you already are. The side canyons of the Badlands are a trap built for exactly this situation. They branch and fork and double back on themselves, every wall the same washed out gold as the last, and they swallow sound and phone signal alike. The phone she trusted for absolutely everything would have been useless to her by now. No service down in the rock, and a battery cooking past the point it would even turn on. She had no paper map, no compass, no extra water, and no clear idea anymore of which direction would take her back. She was wandering, slower and slower, through a place that offered her the same blank answer every way she turned. Time worked against her now, in a way she could not feel. Every minute she spent lost was a minute of water she did not have, in heat that was still climbing toward its afternoon peak. She had told no one her exact plan beyond the ranger she had laughed at. No friend was waiting at the bottom with a worried eye on the time, no partner was tracking her location on a phone, no one in the world who loved her knew precisely where she was or when she was supposed to be back. She had traded all of that away long ago for the freedom to do whatever she wanted, and out here that freedom had nothing left to give her. What followed was slow and disoriented, and, from the outside, almost quiet. She moved through the side canyons with no real direction, the walls all the same, the sun straight overhead and then sliding west, every turn looking like a way out and ending in more rock. She had no shade to rest in and no water to wait on. The smart move, if any move was still smart by then, was to stop and conserve. But a confused, overheating brain rarely makes the smart move, and hers was already past making much of any decision at all. Even if she had somehow been able to call for help, the rescue most people quietly assume is always waiting was not a sure thing on a day like that one. Helicopters do not fly the same in extreme heat, because the thin, superheated air gives the rotor blades far less to grab onto, and operations in the worst of the afternoon get much harder and sometimes get grounded entirely. The people who could have come for her, with no idea she was in trouble, no idea she had left the route hours ago, and no way to reach the fold of Badlands she had wandered into even if somehow they had known to try.
Everybody out there is quietly counting on a helicopter. In that heat, the air gets too thin for the rotors to lift, and that's a bet I would never make.
Heat stroke, once it truly takes hold, moves through the body in stages, and not one of them can be willed away by wanting it badly enough. The confusion deepens into something close to drunkenness. Coordination goes so that walking a straight line becomes impossible. As the core temperature keeps climbing, the organs begin to fail in sequence, and the overheating brain shuts down its higher functions one by one, the way a building powers down floor by floor. A person that far gone stops being able to make a plan, then stops being able to stand, and finally stops being able to do anything at all but sit down where they are. There is a moment where your legs simply stop listening. You are awake, you are scared, and your body has already decided it is finished. Eventually, her body did the deciding for her. The walking slowed to a stagger, the stagger to a few steps at a time, and then to nothing. Somewhere up that dead-end wash, she sat down in the only patch of ground she could reach, and she did not get up again. There was nothing dramatic about it, nothing like the movies, just a strong young woman quietly running out of everything a person needs to stay alive in a place that had been trying to tell her exactly that since the moment she stepped out of her car. The desert did not cool off anywhere near fast enough to save her. Even after the sun finally dropped behind the ridgelines, the rock held the day's heat for hours and kept breathing it back out into the dark, and by then, the damage inside her was long past undoing. She was off any trail, a searcher would walk in the dark, tucked up a sidewash in the Badlands with a dead phone and an empty bottle, in a silence so total that most people will never experience anything like it in their lives. All those followers, all that constant noise that had filled every single day of her adult life, and there was not another person anywhere near her in that black stretch of desert. Thousands of people watched her that week, and she died with not one of them within 50 miles of her. The desert never once cared how many followers she had. Liana Marchetti died that night in a side canyon of the Golden Canyon Badlands of hyperthermia, her body finally overwhelmed by a heat it was never built to withstand, only a handful of hours after she had smiled into her own camera and waved off the one man who tried to save her life. She had come to the hottest place on Earth to prove that she could beat it, in the worst week anyone had ever picked to try, and the desert did to her exactly what the ranger had said it would, on very nearly the timeline he had laid out. She was never going to win that fight. She had walked away from her one real chance of surviving it. The moment she walked away from him, her rental car sat alone in the Golden Canyon lot through the evening and deep into the night. She had come to the park by herself, with no one expecting her anywhere, so there was no worried phone call to start things sooner, just that one car that never left. In a heat wave like that, rangers keep an eye on the popular trailheads, and when the car was still there long after dark, the Park Service knew someone had gone in and not come out. At first light the next morning, they began to look. It still took them well into the morning to find her, off the marked loop, up a dead-end sidewash she never should have entered. The Inyo County coroner ruled the cause of death as hyperthermia, heat stroke, the very thing the signs in that parking lot warn about in big red letters, the very thing Cal Renfro had stood there and told her to her face. On the phone recovered with her body, investigators found all of it, the gorgeous Golden Canyon, the bright, confident narration, and near the very beginning, the clip of a park ranger calmly trying to talk her out of the exact hike that ended up killing her. She had filmed her own warning, she had filmed herself laughing it off. And the thousands of people who had spent years cheering her on for being fearless were left to sit with what fearless had finally cost. Cal told her face to face how this would end, and she filmed it for laughs. He drove home that night safely. Meanwhile, she lost her life in one of the most brutal ways possible.